Chapter 16 of the History of Standard Oil, Volume 2. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 16, Part 2, The Price of Oil. About the end of 1894, the depression of export oil was abandoned, as the chart shows. Notice that from 1895 to 1898 the margin remained at about 4 cents, that in 1900 it rose to 6 cents, and from that time until June, 1904, it swung between 4½ and 5. The increasing competition in Western Europe of independent American oils, and the rapid rise since 1895, particularly of Russian oil, are what has kept this margin down. It is doubtful, such is the growing strength of these various competitive forces, if the Standard Oil Trust will ever be able to put up the margin on export oils. If there were only the American independents to reckon with, a compromise might be possible. But Russia, Burma, and Sumatra are all in the game. By 1896 Russia was exporting 210,000,000 gallons of petroleum products. America in that year exported over 931,000,000 gallons. And these products were going to nearly every part of Europe and Asia. They began to cut heavily into the trade of the Standard in China, India, Great Britain, and France. By 1899 the exports of Russian oil were over 347,000,000 gallons, in 1901 over 428,000,000 gallons. In China, India, and Great Britain particularly has the Russian competition increased. While at one time the Standard Oil Company had almost the entire oil trade at the port of Calcutta, last year, 1903, out of 91,500,000 gallons imported, only about 6,500,000 gallons were of American oil. In China, Sumatra oil is now ahead of American, the report for 1903 being: American 31,060,527 gallons, Sumatra 39,859,508. For the Standard there is good profit in this margin of 4½ cents for export oil. The expenses the margin must cover are the transportation of the crude from the wells to New York, the cost of manufacture, the barrel, and the loading. For 25 years the published charge of the Standard Oil Company for gathering oil from the wells has been 20 cents a barrel. The charge for bringing it to New York has been 40 cents, a little less than 1½ cents a gallon. It costs, by rough calculation, 1/2 cent to make the oil and load it. The barrel is usually reckoned at 2½ cents. Here are 4½ cents for expenses, the entire margin. Where the Standard has the advantage is in its ownership of oil transportation. A common carrier gathering and transporting in 1902 all but perhaps 10,000 barrels of the 150,000 barrels daily production of Eastern oil, the service for which the outsider pays 60 cents, costs it from 10 to 12 cents at the most liberal estimate. Here is over a cent saved on a gallon, and a cent saved, where millions of gallons are in question, makes only not great profits, but keeps down competition. The refiner who to day must pay the Standard rates for transportation cannot compete in export oil with them. In January of 1904, when the chart shows the margin to have been about 4¾ cents, an independent refiner in the state of Ohio, dependent on the Standard for oil, gave the writer a detailed statement of costs and selling prices of products in his refinery. According to his statement, he lost 1 3/5 cents on his export oil. He was forced, of course, to pay Standard transportation prices for crude and railroad charges for refined from Ohio to New York harbor. That there would have been such a transportation situation to day had it not been for the discrimination by the railways, which threw the pipes into the Standard's hands in the first place, and the long story of aggression by which the Standard has kept out rival pipes, and so been able for 25 years to sustain the price for transportation, is of course evident. To day, as 30 years ago, it is transportation advantages, unfairly won, which give the Standard Oil Company its hold. It is not only on transportation that the Standard to day has great advantages over the independent refiner in the export market. As said at the beginning of this chapter, the Standard Oil Company makes the price of refined oil within strict limits. Of course, making the market, it has all the advantages of the inside track. Its transactions can be carried on in anticipation of the rise or fall. For instance, in January of 1904, when there were strong fluctuations in the water white 150° test prices, the agent of an independent refiner, who was in Wall Street trying to keep track of markets for out of town competitors, reported the price as 9.20 cents a gallon. The refiner's goods were refused on the ground that this was above the market. The Standard Oil export man and a broker who worked with the company were consulted. The market was 9.20. Further investigation, however, showed that at headquarters the figure given out privately was 8.70 cents. The disadvantage of the outsider in disposing of his goods is obvious. The Standard makes the official market and undersells it. The situation seems to be the same in practice as that described by Mr. Welch in 1880, though now the fiction of a committee of brokers has been done away with. Of course, there is nothing else to be expected when one body of men control a market. Thus far the illustrations of Mr. Rockefeller's use of his power over the oil market have been drawn from export oil. It is the only market for which official figures can be obtained for the entire period, and it is the market usually quoted in studying the movement of prices. It is of this grade of oil that the largest percentage of product is obtained in distilling petroleum. For instance, in distilling Pennsylvania crude, 52% is Standard white or export oil, 22% water white, the higher grade commonly used in this country, 13% naphtha, 10% tar, 3% loss. The runs vary with different oils, and different refiners turn out different products. The water white oils, while they cost the same to produce, sell from 2 to 3 cents higher. The naphtha costs the same to make as export oil, but sells at a higher price, and many refiners have pet brands. Through some marketing trick they get a fancy price. The Standard Oil Company has a great number of fancy brands of both illuminating and lubricating oils, for which they get large prices, although often the oil itself comes from the same barrels as the ordinary grade. Now it is from the extra price obtained from naphtha, water white, fancy brands, and by products that the independent refiner makes up for his loss on export oil, and the Standard Oil Trust raises its dividends to 48%. The independent refiner quoted above, who in January 1904 lost 1 3/8 cents on export oil, made enough on other products to clear 8.3 cents a barrel on his output, $83 a day clear on a refinery of 1,000 barrels capacity, which represents an investment of $150,000. Turn now to the price of domestic oil, and examine the chart to see if we have fared as well as the exporters. The line C on the chart represents the price per gallon in New York City of 150° water white oil in barrels from the beginning of 1881 to June 1904. The figures used are those of the Oil, Paint and Drug Reporter. A glance at the chart is enough to show that the home market has suffered more violent, if less frequent, fluctuations than the export market. A suggestive observation for the consumer is the effect of a rise in crude on the price of domestic oil. The refined line usually rises 2 or 3 points to every one of the crude line. It is interesting to note, too, how frequently high domestic prices are made to offset low export prices. Thus in 1889, when the Standard was holding export oil low to fight competition in Europe, it kept up domestic oil. The same thing is happening to day. We are helping pay for the Standard's fight with Russian, Romanian, and Asiatic wells. But this line, while it shows what the New York trade has paid, is a poor guide for the country as a whole. Domestic oil indeed has no regular price. Go back as far as anything like trustworthy documents exist, and we find the most astonishing vagaries even in the same state. For instance, in a table presented to a Congressional committee in 1888, and compiled from answers to letters sent out by George Weiss, the price of 110° oil in barrels from Texas ranged from 10 to 20 cents; in Arkansas of 150° oil in barrels from 8 to 18; in Tennessee the same oil from 8 to 16; in Mississippi the same from 11 to 17. In the eighties prime white oil sold in barrels wholesale in Arkansas all the way from 8 to 14 cents; in Illinois from 7½ to 10; in Mississippi from 7¼ to 13½; in Nebraska 7½ to 18; in South Carolina 8 to 12½; and in Utah 13 to 23. Freight and handling might, of course, account for 1 to 2 cents of the difference, but not more. A table of the wide variation in the price of oil, compiled in 1892, showed the range of price of prime white oil in the United States to be as follows: in barrels 6 to 25 cents; in cases 14 to 34½ cents; in bulk 3½ to 25 cents. The same wide range was found in water white oil; in barrels 6½ to 30 cents per gallon; in cases 16 to 35 cents per gallon; in bulk 3½ to 29 cents per gallon. In 1896 an investigation of prices of oil sold from tank wagons in the different towns of Ohio in the same week was made and was afterward offered as sworn testimony in a trust investigation in that state. The price per gallon ranged from 4¾ cents to 8¾ cents. The most elaborate investigation of oil prices ever made was that instigated by the recent Industrial Commission. In February, 1901, the Commission sent out inquiries to 5,000 retail dealers scattered from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the lakes to the Gulf, asking the prices of certain commodities, among them illuminating oils. 1,578 replies were received. The table prepared offered striking examples of the variability of prices. Thus, in Colorado the wholesale price of illuminating oil, 150° test, varied from 13 to 20 cents; in Delaware 8 to 10; in Illinois 6 to 10; in Alabama 10.50 to 16; in Michigan 5.50 to 12.25; in Missouri 7.5 to 12.5; in Kentucky 7 to 11.5; in Ohio 5.5 to 9.75; in California 12.5 to 20; in Utah 20 to 22; in Maine 8.25 to 12.75, freight included in all these prices. The difference between the highest and lowest wholesale prices in the same state varies from 8 cents in Oregon (12.5 to 20.5) to 1.5 in Rhode Island (8.5 to 10). Of course, in the former case 2 and even 3 cents of the difference may be due to freight, but hardly more. Take adjoining states, for instance. In Vermont there is a difference of 4.5 cents between the highest and lowest price of oil; in New Hampshire only 1.75; in Delaware there is a difference of 2 cents; in Virginia of 6. Compare now the lowest price in different states. In Ohio and Pennsylvania oil was sold as low as 5.5; 6.5 is the lowest in New York State; 8.5 the lowest in Rhode Island; and 7 the lowest in New Jersey. In Indiana oil sells as low as 5.5, but in Kansas nothing below 8.5 is reported. The freight rate to Atchison, Kansas, from Whiting, Indiana, which supplies both of these states, is 1.7 per gallon. The freight rate from Whiting to Indianapolis is .5 per gallon. Not long ago there fell into the writer's hands a sheet from one of the ledgers forming a part of the Standard Oil Company's remarkable system of bookkeeping. This sheet gave the cost and selling price per gallon of different grades of refined oil at over a dozen stations in the same state in October, 1901. In the account of cost of oil were included net cost, freight, inspection, cost of barrels, and cost of marketing. The selling price was given and the margin of profit computed. The selling price of water white from tank wagons — it is customary for Standard tank wagons to deliver oil from their stations to local dealers — ranged from 8½ to 11½ cents, and the profit on the oil sold from the wagons varied from ½ cent to over 3 cents. Now, in considering these differences, liberal allowance for freight rates must be made. Something of what these allowances should be can be judged from the table of oil freights which the Industrial Commission published with its schedule of prices. From this table many interesting comparisons can be made. For instance, it cost the Standard Oil Company, if they paid the open rate their rivals did, 1.5 cents to send a gallon of oil from Whiting, Indiana, their supply station, to Mobile, Alabama. They sold their oil in Alabama at wholesale from 11.5 to 16 cents. The net cost of this oil was under 5 cents in February, 1901. It cost them the same 1.5 cents to send a gallon of oil to Des Moines, Iowa, if they paid the open rate, but in Iowa they sold it from 7 to 11. The freight from Whiting to New Orleans was the same 1.5 cents, but prices in Louisiana ranged from 9 to 14 cents. According to the investigation, the average wholesale price of oil, including freight, ranged from 8.27 in Pennsylvania to 25.78 in Nevada. Freights and handling considered, there is, it is evident, nothing like a settled price or profit for illuminating oil in the United States. Now there is no one who will not admit that it is for the good of the consumer that the normal market price of any commodity should be such as will give a fair and even profit all over the country. That is, that freights and expense of handling being considered, oil should sell at the same profit in Texas as in Ohio. That such must be the case where there is free and general competition is evident. But from the beginning of its power over the market, the Standard Oil Company has sold domestic oil at prices varying from less than the cost of the crude oil it took to make it up to a profit of 100% or more. Wherever there has been a loss, or merely what is called a reasonable profit of, say, 10%, an examination of the tables quoted above shows conclusively it has been due to competition. The competition is not, and has not been since 1879, very great. In that year the Standard Oil Company claimed 95% of the refining interest of the country. In 1888 they claimed about 80%. In 1898, 83%. This 5 to 17% of independent interest is too small to come into active competition, of course, at all points. So long as one interest handles 83% of a product, it is clear that it has the trade as a whole in its hands. The competition it encounters will be local only, but it is this local competition unquestionably that has brought down the price of oil at various points and caused a striking variation in prices recorded in the charts of the Industrial Commission and other investigations. The writer has before her a pile of 100 or more letters written in the '80s by dealers in 12 different states. These letters tell the effect on the prices of the introduction of an independent oil into a territory formerly occupied exclusively by the Standard. Calvert, Tennessee. The Waters Pierce Oil Company, Standard, so reduced the price of their oil here when mine arrived that I will have some trouble to dispose of mine. Chattanooga, Tennessee. Cut the price of oil that had been selling at 21 cents to 17 cents. Pine Bluff, Arkansas. While the merchants here would like to buy from some other than the Standard, they cannot afford to take the risks of loss. We have just had an example of 100 barrels opposition oil which was brought here, which had the effect of bringing Waters Pierce Oil Company's oil down from 18 to 13 cents, 1 cent less than cost of opposition, with refusal on their part to sell to anyone that bought from other than their company. Vicksburg, Mississippi. The Chase Carley Company, Standard, is now offering 110° oil at 9 cents to any and every one. Shall we meet their prices? All they want is to get us out of the market, then they would at once advance price of oil. These are but illustrations of the entire set of letters. Prices dropped at once by Standard agents on the introduction of an independent oil. A table offered to Congress in 1888, giving the extent of their cutting in the Southwest, shows that it ranged from 14 to 220%. Every investigation made since shows that it is the touch of the competitor which brings down the price. For instance, in the cost and profit sheet from a Standard ledger referred to above, there was one station on the list at which oil was selling at a loss. On investigation the writer found it to be a point at which an independent jobber had been trying to get a market. If one examines the tables of prices in the recent report of the Industrial Commission, he finds that wherever there is a low price there is competition. Thus at Indianapolis, the only town in the state of Indiana reporting competition, the wholesale price of oil was 5½ cents, although 40 out of the 53 Indiana towns reporting gave from 8 cents to 10½ cents as the wholesale price per gallon. These prices included freight. Taking Indianapolis as a centre, the local freight on oil to any point in Indiana is in no case over a cent. In April, 1904, inquiry showed the same striking difference between prices in Indianapolis, where 6 independent companies are now established, and neighbouring towns to which competition has not as yet reached. The advent of an independent concern in Morristown, New Jersey, brought down the price to grocers to 7½ cents and to housewives to 10, but in the neighbouring towns of Elizabeth and Plainfield, where only the Standard is reported, the grocers pay 9 cents and the housewives 12 and 11 respectively. In Akron, Ohio, where an independent company was operating at the time the investigation was made, oil was sold at wholesale at 5 3/4 cents. At Painesville, nearer Cleveland, the shipping point at 9 1/4 cents. In Richmond, Virginia, one dealer reported to the Commission a wholesale price of 5 cents and added, "A cut rate between oil companies has been selling at 9 and 10 cents." In the month of April of 1904, 150° oil was selling from tank wagons in Baltimore, where there is competition, at 9 cents. In Washington, where there is no competition, it sold at 10½ cents, and in Annapolis, no competition, at 11 cents. In Seaford, Delaware, the same oil sold at 8 cents under competition. The freight rates are practically the same to all these points, and so one might go on indefinitely, showing how the introduction of an independent oil has always reduced the price. As a rule, the appearance of the oil has led to a sharp contest or "oil war," at which, not infrequently, both sides have sold at a loss. The Standard, being able to stand a loss indefinitely, usually won out. An interesting local oil war, which occurred in 1896 and 1897 in New York and Philadelphia, figured in the reports of the Industrial Commission, and illustrates very well the usual influence on Standard prices of the incoming of competition. On March 20, 1896, the Pure Oil Company put 3 tank wagons into New York City. The Standard's price of water white oil from the tank wagons that day was 9½ cents, and the Pure Oil Company followed it. In less than a week the Standard had cut to 8 cents along the route of the Pure Oil Company wagons. In April the price was cut to 7 cents. By December, 1876, it had fallen to 6 cents. By December, 1897, to 5.4. It is true that crude oil was falling at this time, but the fall in water white was out of all proportion. For while the price of refined on March 20 and the average price of refined in April along the Pure Oil Company route, there was a fall of 2½ cents, in crude there was a fall of but 0.4 of a cent. Refined fell from 7 cents in April to 6 cents in May, and crude fell 0.1 of a cent. John D. Archbold, in answering the figures given by the Pure Oil Company to the Industrial Commission, accused them of carelessness, and gave the average monthly price of crude and refined to show that no such glaring discrepancy had taken place. Mr. Archbold gives the average price in March, for instance, as 7.98, and in April as 7.31 cents. However, his price is the average to all the trade of Greater New York and its vicinity, whereas the prices of the Pure Oil Company are those they met in their limited competition. As Professor Jenks remarked at the examination, it might easily be therefore that your Standard average price would be what you had given, and that to a good many special customers with whom the Pure Oil Company was trying to deal it could be 5½ cents. That this was the fact seems to be proved by the quotations for water white oil from tank wagons, which were published from week to week in trade journals like the Oil, Paint and Drug Reporter. These prices show 9 7/8 cents for water white on March 21, and an average of 9.4 cents in April. Evidently only a part of the trade of all Greater New York and vicinity got the benefit of averages quoted to the Industrial Commission by Mr. Archbold. If competition persists, the result usually has been permanently lowered prices than in territory where competition has been run out or has never entered. For instance, why should oil be sold to a dealer at nearly 4 cents more on an average in Kansas than in Kentucky, when the freight from Whiting to Kansas is only a cent more? For no reason except that in Kentucky there has been persistent competition for 25 years, and in Kansas none has ever secured a solid foothold. Why should Colorado pay an average of 16.9 cents for oil per gallon and California 14.6, when the freight from Whiting differs but 1/10 of 1 cent? For no reason except that a few years ago competition was driven from Colorado, and in California it still exists. Indeed, any consecutive study of the Standard Oil Company's use of its power over the price of either export or domestic oil must lead to the conclusion that it has always been used to the fullest extent possible without jeopardising it, that we have always paid more for our refined oil than we would have done if there had been free competition. But why should we expect anything else? This is the chief object of combinations. Certainly the candid members of the Standard Oil Company would be the last men to argue that they give the public any more of the profits they may get by combination than they can help. One of the ablest and frankest of them, H. Rogers, when before the Industrial Commission in 1899, was asked how it happened that in 20 years the Standard Oil Company had never cheapened the cost of gathering and transporting oil in pipe lines by the least fraction of a cent, that it cost the oil producer just as much now as it did 20 years ago to get his oil taken away from the wells and to transport it to New York. And Mr. Rogers answered with delightful candour, "We are not in business for our health, but are out for the dollars." John D. Archbold was asked at the same time if it were not true that by virtue of its great power the Standard Oil Company was enabled to secure prices that, on the whole, were above those under competition, and Mr. Archbold said, "Well, I hope so." But these are frank answers, perhaps surprised out of the gentleman. The able and wary president of the great concern, John D. Rockefeller, is more cautious in his admissions. On the witness stand in 1888 he was forced to admit, after some skilful evasion, that the control the Standard Oil Company had of prices was such that they could raise or lower them at will. "But," added Mr. Rockefeller, "we would not do it." The whole colloquy between the examiner and Mr. Rockefeller is interesting. Question: Isn't it a fact that the 9 trustees controlling the large amount of capital which the Standard Oil Trust does could very easily advance or depress the market price of oil if they saw fit? Answer: I don't think they would. Question: I don't ask whether they would. Could they do it? Answer: I suppose it would be possible for these gentlemen, if they should buy enough oil, it would make the price go up. There was considerable sparring, Mr. Rockefeller trying to explain away his answer. Question: I can't get you down to my question. That is a very great power to wield. Answer: Certainly. An individual or a combination of men can advance the price or, more or less, depress the price of any commodity. Question: But if you desire to increase, to put up the price of the refined oil, or to put down the price of the crude oil, is it within your power to do it in the way I have indicated, by staying out of the market or going into the market to purchase, controlling 75% of the demand for the crude oil? Answer: It would be a temporary effect, but that is all. Question: By stopping the manufacture of refined oil, your refineries representing so large a proportion would tend to raise the price? Answer: That is something we never do. Our business is to increase all the time, not to decrease. Question: Really your notion is that the Standard Oil Trust is a beneficial organisation to the public? Answer: I beg with all respect to present the record which shows that it is. For many of the world it is a matter of little moment, no doubt, whether oil sells for 8 or 12 cents a gallon. It becomes a tragic matter sometimes, however, as in 1902 1903, when, in the coal famine, the poor, deprived of coal, depended on oil for heat. In January, 1903, oil was sold to dealers from tank wagons in New York City at 11 cents a gallon. That oil cost the independent refiner, who paid full transportation charges, and marketed at the cost of a cent a gallon, not over 6.4 cents. It cost the Standard Oil Company probably a cent less. That such a price could prevail under free competition is of course impossible. Throughout the hard winter of 1902 and 1903 the price of refined oil advanced. It was claimed that this was due to the advance in crude, but in every case it was considerably more than that of crude. Indeed, a careful comparative study of oil prices shows that the Standard almost always advances the refined market a good many more points than it does the crude market. The chart shows this. While this has been the rule, there are exceptions, of course, as when a rate war is on. Thus, in the spring of 1904, the severe competition in England of the Shell Transportation Company and of Russian oil caused the Standard to drop export refined considerably more than crude. But, as the chart shows, the domestic oil has been kept up. As a result of the Standard's power over prices, not only does the consumer pay more for oil where competition has not reached or has been killed, but this power is used steadily and with consummate skill to make it hard for men to compete in any branch of the oil business. This history has been but a rehearsal of the operations practiced by the Standard Oil Company to get rid of competition. It was to get rid of competition that the South Improvement Company was formed. It was to get rid of competition that the oil carrying railroads were bullied or persuaded or bribed into unjust discriminations. It was to get rid of competition that the Empire Transportation Company, one of the finest transportation companies ever built up in this country, was wrested from the hands of the men who had developed it. It was to get rid of competition that war was made on the Tidewater Pipe Line, the Crescent Pipe Line, the United States Pipe Line, not to mention a number of similar smaller enterprises. It was to get rid of competition that the Standard spy system was built up, its oil wars instituted, all its perfect methods for making it hard for rivals to do business developed. The most curious feature perhaps of this question of the Standard Oil Company and the price of oil is that there are still people who believe that the Standard has made oil cheap. Men look at this chart and recall that back in the late 60s and 70s they paid 50 and 60 cents a gallon for oil, which now they pay 12 or 15 cents for. This, then, they say, is the result of the combination. Mr. Rockefeller himself pointed out this great difference in prices. In 1861, he told the New York Senate Committee, oil sold for 64 cents a gallon, and now it is 6 1/4 cents. The comparison is as misleading as it was meant to be. In 1861 there was not a railway into the Oil Regions. It cost from $3 to $10 to get a barrel of oil to a shipping point. None of the appliances of transportation or storage had been devised. The process of refining was still crude, and there was great waste in the oil. Besides, the markets were undeveloped. Mr. Rockefeller should have noted that oil fell from 61 1/2 in 1861 to 25 5/8 in the year he first took hold of it, and that by his first successful manipulations it went up to 30. He should point out what the successive declines in prices since that day are due to the seaboard pipe lines, to the development of by products, to bulk instead of barrel transportation, to innumerable small economies. People who point to the differences in price, and call it combination, have never studied the price line history in hand. They do not know the meaning of the variation of the line, that it was forced down from 1866 to 1876, when Mr. Rockefeller's first effective combination was secured by competition, and driven up in 1876 and 1877 by the stopping of competition; that it was driven down from 1877 to 1879 by the union of all sorts of competitive forces, producers, independent refiners, the developing of an independent seaboard pipe line, to a point lower than it had ever been before. They forget that when these opposing forces were overcome, and the Standard Oil Company was at least supreme, for 10 years oil never fell a point below the margin reached by competition in 1879, though frequently it rose above that margin. They forget that in 1889, when for the first time in 10 years the margin between crude and refined oil began to fall, it was the competition coming from the rise of American independent interests and the development of foreign oil fields that did it. To believe that the Standard Oil Combination, or any other similar aggregation, would lower prices except under the pressure of the competition they were trying to kill, argues an amazing gullibility. Human experience long ago taught us that if we allowed a man or a group of men autocratic powers in government or church, they used that power to oppress and defraud the public. For centuries the struggle of the nations has been able to obtain stable government, with fair play to the masses. To obtain this we have hedged our kings and emperors and presidents about with 1,000 constitutional restrictions. It has not been possible for us to allow even the church, inspired by religious ideals, to have the full power it has demanded in society. And yet we have here, in the United States, allowed men practically autocratic powers in commerce. We have allowed them special privileges in transportation, bound in no great length of time to kill their competitors, though the spirit of our laws and of the charters of the transportation lines forbade these privileges. We have allowed them to combine in great interstate aggregations, for which we have provided no form of charter or of publicity, although human experience long ago decided that men united in partnerships, companies, or corporations for business purposes must have their powers defined and be subject to a reasonable inspection and publicity. As a natural result of these extraordinary powers, we see, as in the case of the Standard Oil Company, the price of a necessity of life within the control of a group of 9 men, as able, as energetic, and as ruthless in business operations as any 9 men the world has ever seen combined. They have exercised their power over prices with almost preternatural skill. It has been their most cruel weapon in stifling competition, a sure means of reaping usurious dividends, and at the same time a most persuasive argument in hoodwinking the public. This is the end of Chapter 16, Part 2. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 17 of the History of Standard Oil, Volume 2, by Ida Tarbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 17. The Legitimate Greatness of the Standard Oil Company. While there can be no doubt that the determining factor in the success of the Standard Oil Company in securing a practical monopoly of the oil industry has been the special privileges it has enjoyed since the beginning of its career, it is equally true that those privileges alone will not account for its success. Something besides illegal advantages has gone into the making of the Standard Oil Trust. Had it possessed only the qualities which the general public has always attributed to it, its overthrow would have come before this. But this huge bulk, blackened by commercial sin, has always been strong in all great business qualities, in energy, in intelligence, in dauntlessness. It has always been rich in youth as well as greed, in brains as well as unscrupulousness. If it has played its great game with contemptuous indifference to fair play and to nice legal points of view, it has played it with consummate ability, daring, and address. The silent, patient, all-seeing man who has led it in its transportation raids has led it no less successfully in what may be called its legitimate work. Nobody has appreciated more fully than he those qualities which alone make for permanent stability and growth in commercial ventures. He has insisted on these qualities, and it is because of this insistence that the Standard Oil Trust has always been something besides a fine piece of brigandage, with the fate of brigandage before it, that it has been a thing with life and future. If one attempts to analyse what may be called the legitimate greatness of Mr. Rockefeller's creation in distinction to its illegitimate greatness, he will find at the foundation the fact that it is as perfectly centralised as the Catholic Church or the Napoleonic government. As we pointed out in a former chapter, the entire business was placed in 1882 in the hands of 9 trustees, of whom Mr. Rockefeller was president. These trustees have always acted exactly as if they were 9 partners in a business, and the only persons concerned in it. They met daily, giving their whole time to the management and development of the concern, as the partners in a dry goods house would. Anything in the oil world might come under their ken, from a smoking wick in Oshkosh to the competition of Russian oil in China. Everything, but nothing came unless it was necessary, for below them, and sifting things for their eyes, were committees which dealt with the various departments of the business. There was a crude committee which considered the subject of crude oil the world over; a manufacturing committee which studied the making of refined, the utilisation of waste, the development of new products; a marketing committee which considered the markets. Before each of these committees was laid daily all the information to be found on earth concerning its particular field. Not only were there reports made to it of what was doing in its line in the Standard Oil Trust, but information connected with such work everywhere by everybody. These committees not only knew all about their own business, they knew all about everybody else's. The manufacturing committee knew just what each of the feeble independent refiners still existing was doing, what its resources and advantages were. The transportation committee knew what rates it got, the marketing committee knew its market. Thus the fullest information about new developments of crude, new openings for refined, new processes of manufacture, was always at the command of the 9 trustees of the trust. How did they get this information? As the press does, by a wide spreading system of reporters. In 1882 the Standard had correspondents in every town in the oil fields, and to day it has them not only there, but in every capital of the globe. It is a common enough thing indeed in European capitals to run across high class newspaper correspondents, consuls, or business men who add to their incomes by private reporting to the Standard Oil Company. The people in their employ naturally report all they learn. There are also outsiders who report what they pick up, occasional contributions. There is more than one man in the Oil Regions who has made his livelihood for years by picking up information for the Standard. Spies, they are called there. They may deserve the name sometimes, but the service may be perfectly legitimate. These trustees, then, know everything about the oil business, and they have used their information. Nobody ever used information more profitably. What was learned was applied, and affected the whole great structure, for by a marvellous genius in organisation Mr. Rockefeller had devised a machine with a head whose thinking was felt from the seat of power in New York City to the humblest pipe line patrol on Oil Creek. This head controlled each one of the scattered plants with absolute precision. Take the refineries. They were individual plants, having a manager and a board of directors like any outside plant, but these plants were not free agents. According to J. Vandergrift's testimony in 1879, the Imperial Refinery, of which he was president, had no control of its oil after it was made. The Standard Oil Company of Cleveland took charge of it at Oil City, and arranged for transportation and for marketing. The managers of the Central Association, into which the allied refiners went in 1875 under Mr. Rockefeller's presidency, had irrevocable authority to make all purchases of crude oil and sales of refined oil, as well as to negotiate for all railroad and pipe line freights and transportation expenses for each of the refineries. Each plant, of course, was limited as to the amount of oil it could make. Thus, in 1876, when the Cleveland firm of Scofield, Shurmer and Teagle went into a running arrangement with Mr. Rockefeller on condition that he get from them the same rebates he enjoyed, it was agreed that the firm should manufacture only 85,000 barrels a year, though they had a capacity of 180,000 barrels. One of Mr. Rockefeller's greatest achievements has been to bring men who had built up their own factories and managed them to suit themselves to work harmoniously under such limitations. As this history has shown, the first attempt to harness the refiners failed because they would not obey the rules. No doubt the chief reason why they finally consented to them was that only by doing so could they get transportation rates equally advantageous to those of the Standard Oil Company. But, having consented and finding it profitable, they were kept in line by an ingenious system of competition which must have done much to satisfy their need of individual effort and their pride in independent work. In the investigation of 1879, when the producers were trying to find out the real nature of the Standard Alliance, they were much puzzled by the sworn testimony of certain Standard men that the factories they controlled were competing, and competing hard, with the Standard Oil Company of Cleveland. How could this be? Being bitter in heart and reckless in tongue, the oil men denounced the statements as perjury, but they were the literal truth. Each refinery in the alliance was required to make to Mr. Rockefeller each month a detailed statement of its operations. These statements were compared and the results made known. If the Acme at Titusville had refined cheaper that month than any other member of the alliance, the fact was made known. If this cheapness continued to show, the others were sent to study the Acme methods. Whenever an improvement showed, that improvement received credit, and the others were sent to find the secret. The keenest rivalry resulted. Every factory was on its mettle. This supervision took account of the least detail. There is a story often told in the Oil Regions to illustrate the minuteness of the supervision. In commenting as usual on the monthly competitive statements, as they are called, Mr. Rockefeller called the attention of a certain refiner to a discrepancy in his reports. It referred to bungs, articles worth about as much in a refinery as pins are in a household. Last month, the comment ran, you reported on hand 1,119 bungs. 10,000 were sent to you at the beginning of this month. You have used 9,527 this month. You report 1,012 on hand. What has become of the other 580? The writer has it on high authority that the current version of this story is not true, but it reflects very well the impression the Oil Regions have of the thoroughness of Mr. Rockefeller's supervision. The Oil Regions, which were notoriously extravagant in their business methods, resented this care and called it meanness, but the Oil Regions were wrong and Mr. Rockefeller was right. Take care of the bungs and the barrels will take care of themselves is as good a policy in a refinery as the old saw it paraphrases is in financiering. There were other features of this revolutionary management which caused deep resentment in the oil world. Chief among them was the dismantling and abandoning of plants which the Standard had acquired and which it claimed were so badly placed or so equipped that it did not pay to run them. There was reason enough in many cases for dissatisfaction with the process of acquisition, but having acquired the refineries, the Standard showed its wisdom in abandoning many of them. Take Pittsburgh, for instance. When Mr. Lockhart began to absorb his neighbours in 1874, there were some 25 plants in and around the town. They were of varying capacity, from little 10-barrel stills of antiquated design and out-of-the-way location, to complete plants like the Citizens, which Mr. Tack described in Chapter 5. But how could Mr. Lockhart manage these as they stood to good advantage? It might pay the owner of the little refinery to run it, for he was his own stillman, his own pipe fitter, his own foreman, and did not expect large returns. But it would have been absurd for Mr. Lockhart to try to run it. He simply carted away any available machinery, sold what he could for junk, and left the debris. Now, one of the most melancholy sights on earth is an abandoned oil refinery. And it was the desolation of the picture, combined as it always was in the Oil Regions, with the history of the former owners, that caused much of the outcry. It was a thing that the oil men could not get over, largely because it was a sight always before their eyes. Bitter as this policy was for those who had suffered by the Standard's campaigns, It was, of course, the only thing for the trust to do. Indeed, that was what it had been waging war on the independents for, that it might shut them down and dismantle them, that there might be less oil made and higher prices for what it made. This wisdom in locating factories has continued to characterise the Standard operations. It works only plants which pay, and it places its plants where they can be operated to the best advantage. Many fine examples of the relation of location in manufacturing to crude supply and to markets are to be seen in the Standard Oil Company plants to day. For example, refined for foreign shipments is made at the seaboard, and the vessels which carry it are loaded at docks as at the works at Bayonne, New Jersey. The cost of transportation from factory to ship, a large item in the old days, is eliminated entirely. The Middle West market is now supplied almost entirely from the Standard factories at Whiting, Indiana, a town built by the Standard Oil Company for refining Ohio oil. Here 25,000 barrels of oil are refined daily, and from this central point distributed to the Mississippi Valley. All of the industries which have been grafted onto the refineries have always been run with the same exact regard to minute economies. These industries were numerous because of Mr. Rockefeller's great principle, pay a profit to nobody. From his earliest ventures in combination he had applied this principle. Mr. Blanchard's explanation to the Hepburn Commission in 1879 of why the Standard had controlled the Erie's yards at Weehawken since 1874 shows exactly Mr. Rockefeller's point of view. This policy of paying nobody a profit took Mr. Rockefeller into the barrel business. In 1872, when Mr. Rockefeller became master of the Cleveland oil business, the purchase of barrels was one of a refiner's heaviest expenses. In an estimate of the cost of producing a gallon of refined oil in 1873, made in the Oil City Derrick, and accepted as correct by that paper, the cost of the barrel is put at 4 cents a gallon, which was more than the crude oil cost at that date. Even at 4 cents a gallon, barrels were hard to get, so great was the demand. If a refiner could get his barrels back, of course there was a saving. A returned barrel was estimated to be worth 2 3/4 cents, but the return could not be counted on. Empty barrels, coming from Europe particularly, and consigned to Western shippers, were frequently seized in New York by Eastern refiners. The need was held to justify the deed, like thieving in famine time. Fortunes were made in barrels, and dealers hearing of a big supply in Europe have been known to charter a vessel and go for them, and reap rich profits. In fact, a whole volume of commercial tragedy and comedy hangs around the oil barrel. Now it was to the barrel, the holy blue barrel, that Mr. Rockefeller gave early attention. He determined to make it himself. One of the earliest outside ventures of the Standard Oil Company in Cleveland was barrel works, and Mr. Rockefeller was soon getting for 2 1/2 cents what his rivals paid 4 for, though he was by no means the only refiner who manufactured barrels in the early days. Each factory aimed to add barrel works as soon as able. The amount the Standard Oil Company saved on this one item is evident when the extent of its business is considered. The year before the trust was formed, 1881, they manufactured 4,500,000 barrels, an average of about 15,000 a day. Since that time the barrel has been gradually going out of the oil business, bulk transportation taking its place very largely. Nevertheless, in 1901 the Standard Oil Company manufactured about 3,000,000 new barrels. In the period since they began the manufacture of barrels, their factories have introduced some small savings which in the aggregate amount to large sums. For instance, they have improved the lap of the hoop, a small thing, but one which amounted in 1901 to something like $15,000. Some $50,000 a year was saved by a slight increase in the size of the tankage. The Standard claims that these economies are so small in themselves that it only pays to practice them where there is a large aggregate business. More important than the barrel to day, however, is the tin can, for it is in tin cans that all the enormous quantities of refined sent to tropical and oriental countries must go to prevent deterioration. And nowhere does the policy of economy which Mr. Rockefeller has worked out show better than in one of the Standard canning works. In 1902 the writer visited the largest of the Standard can factories, the Devoe on the East River, Long Island City. It has a capacity of 70,000 5-gallon cans a day, and is probably the largest can factory in the world. At the entrance of the place a man was sweeping up carefully the dirt on the floor and wheeling it away, not to be dumped in the river, however. The dirt was to be sifted for tin filings and solder dust. At every step something was saved. The Standard buys the tin for its cans in Wales because it is cheaper. It would not be cheaper if it were not for a vagary in administering the tariff by which the duty on tin plate is refunded if the tin is made into receptacles to be exported. This clause was probably made for the benefit of the Standard, it being the largest single consumer of tin plate in the United States. In 1901 the Standard Oil Company imported over 60,000 tons of tin with a value of over $1 million. This tin comes in sheets packed in flat boxes, which are opened by throwing. It is quicker than opening by a hammer, and time is considered as valuable as tin filings. The empty boxes are sold by the hundred to the Long Island gardens for growing plants in, and the broken covers are sold for kindling. The trimmings which result from shaping the tin sheets for a can are gathered into bundles and sold to chemical works or foundries. There is the same care taken with solder as with tin, the amount each workman uses being carefully gauged. The canning plants, like the refineries, compare their results monthly, and the laurels go to the manager who has saved the most ounces of solder, the most hours, the most footsteps. The 5-gallon can turned out at Devoe is a marvel of evolution. The present methods of manufacture are almost entirely the work of Herman Miller, known in Standard circles as the father of the 5-gallon can, and a fine type of the German inventor he is. The machinery for making the can has been so developed that while in 1865, when Mr. Miller began his work under Charles Pratt, one man and a boy soldered 850 cans in a day, in 1880 3 men made 8,000, and since 1893 3 men have made 24,000. It is an actual fact that a tin can is made by Miller in just about the time it takes to walk from the point of the factory where the sheets of tin are unloaded to the point where the finished article is filled with oil. And here is a nice point in combination. Not far away from the canning works on Newtown Creek is an oil refinery. This oil runs to the canning works, and as the new made cans come down by a chute from the works above, where they have just been finished, they are filled, 12 at a time, with the oil made a few miles away. The filling apparatus is admirable. As the new made cans come down the chute they are distributed, 12 in a row, along one side of a turntable. The turntable is revolved, and the cans come directly under 12 measures, each holding 5 gallons of oil. A turn of a valve, and the cans are full. The table is turned a quarter, and while 12 more cans are filled and 12 fresh ones are distributed, 4 men with soldering coppers put the caps on the first set. Another quarter turn, and men stand ready to take the cans from the filler, and while they do this, 12 more are having caps put on, 12 more are filling, and 12 are coming to their place from the chute. The cans are placed at once in wooden boxes standing ready, and after a 24-hour wait for discovering leaks, are nailed up and carted to a nearby door. This door opens on the river, and there at anchor by the side of the factory is a vessel chartered for South America or China or where not, waiting to receive the cans which a little more than 24 hours before were tin sheets lying in flat boxes. It is a marvellous example of economy not only in materials but in time and in footsteps. With Mr. Rockefeller's genius for detail there went a sense of the big and vital factors in the oil business, and a daring in laying hold of them which was very like military genius. He saw strategic points like a Napoleon, and he swooped on them with the suddenness of a Napoleon. This master ability has been fully illustrated already in this work. Mr. Rockefeller's capture of the Cleveland refineries in 1872 was as dazzling an achievement as it was a hateful one. The campaign by which the Empire Transportation Company was wrested from the Pennsylvania Railroad, viewed simply as a piece of brigandage, was admirable. The man saw what was necessary to his purpose, and he never hesitated before it. His courage was steady, and his faith in his ideas unwavering. He simply knew that was the thing to do, and he went ahead with the serenity of the man who knows. After the formation of the trust, the demand for these qualities were constant. For instance, the contract which the Standard signed with the producers in February, 1880, pledged them to take care of a production of 65,000 barrels a day. When they signed this agreement, there was above ground nearly 9½ million barrels of oil. The production increased at a frightful rate for 4 years. At the end of 1880, there were stocks over 17 million above ground. In 1881 over 25 million. 1882 over 34 million. 1883 over 35 million. And 1884 over 36 million. And the United Pipelines took care of this production, with the aid of the producers who built tanks neck and neck with them. In 1880 the Standard people averaged over 1 iron tank a day, the tanks holding from 25 to 35,000 barrels. There were not tank builders enough in the United States to do the work, and crews were brought from Canada and England. This, of course, called for an enormous expenditure of money, for tanks cost from $7,000 to $10,000 apiece. Rich as the United Pipelines were, they were forced to borrow money in these years of excessive production, for they had to lay lines as well as build tanks. There were nearly 4,000 miles of pipe line laid in the Bradford region alone from 1878 to 1884, and these lines connected with upward of 20,000 wells. From the time it completed its pipeline monopoly, the Standard has followed oil wherever found. It has had to do it to keep its hold on the business, and its courage never yet has faltered, though it has demanded some extraordinary efforts. In 1891 a great deposit of oil was tapped in the McDonald Field of southwestern Pennsylvania. The monthly production increased from 50,000 barrels in June to 1,600,000 in December. It is an actual fact that in the McDonald Field the United Pipelines increased the daily capacity of 3,500 barrels, which they had at the beginning of July, to one of 26,000 barrels by the 1st of September, and by the 1st of December they could handle 90,000 barrels a day. If one considers what this means, one sees that it compares favourably with the great ordnance and mobilizing feats of the Civil War. To accomplish it, rolling mills and boiler shops in various cities worked night and day to turn out the pipe, the pumps, the engines, the boilers which were needed. Transportation had to be arranged, crews of men obtained, a wild country prepared, sawmills to cut the quantities of timber needed built, and this vast amount of material placed and set to work. The same audacity and effectiveness are shown by the Standard in attacking situations created by new developments in handling business. The Seaboard Pipe Line is a notable example. When the Standard completed its pipeline monopoly at the end of 1877, the pipe line was still regarded as the feeder of the railroad. Naturally, the railroads were seriously opposed to its becoming anything more. In Pennsylvania particularly, the laws had been so manipulated by the Pennsylvania Railroad as to prevent the pipe line carrying oil even for short distances in competition with them. Now, for many years it had been believed that the pipe line could carry oil long distance, many claimed to the seaboard, and as soon as the independents found that the oil-bearing roads were acting solely in the interest of the Standard, they began an agitation for a seaboard line which finally terminated in the Tidewater Line, 104 miles long, carrying oil from the Bradford field to Williamsport on the Reading Railroad, and it was certain that the Tidewater eventually would get to the seaboard. That the day of the railroad as a carrier of crude oil was over when the Tidewater began to pump oil was obvious both to Mr. Rockefeller and to the railroad presidents, and without hesitation he seized the idea. By 1883 the Standard was pumping oil to New York, and the railroads that had served so effectively in building up the trust were practically out of the crude business. It was this audacious and splendid stroke, practically freeing him from the railroads, which made the passage of the Interstate Commerce Bill a matter of comparatively small importance to Mr. Rockefeller. To be sure, he still needed the railroads for refined, but he could so place his refineries that this service would be greatly minimised. The legislation which the Oil Regions of Pennsylvania demanded for 15 years in hope of securing an equal chance in transportation came too late. By the time the bill was passed, the pipe had replaced the rail as the great oil carrier, and the pipes were not merely under Mr. Rockefeller's control, as the rails had been, they belonged to him. It was little wonder, then, that the passage of the great bill did not ruffle his serenity. Little wonder that the Oil Regions, realising the situation, so tragic in its irony, as fully as Mr. Rockefeller did, felt an exasperation almost uncontrolled over it. Yet the seaboard pipe line was no development of the Standard Oil Company. The idea had been conceived and the practicability demonstrated by others, but it was seized by the Standard as soon as it proved possible. This quick sense of the real value of new developments, and this alertness in seizing them, have been among the strongest elements in the Standard's success, and every new line of action was developed to its utmost. Take the work the Standard began in 1879 on the foreign market. Before the Standard Oil Company was known save as one of the several prosperous Cleveland refineries, the foreign trade had been developed until petroleum was fourth in our list of exports, and it went literally to every civilized country on the globe. In 1874 Colonel Forney made a trip through the Orient, and he wrote in one of his letters that he found both Babylon and Nineveh to be lighted with American petroleum, and that while he was in Damascus a census was taken to ascertain how much petroleum was needed for each house in the place, and a proposition was made for its entire use. At present, said the Derrick, in commenting on this letter, petroleum is the chief commercial representative of the United States in the Levant and the Orient. The same dithyrambic paragraphs were written by oil men then as by the Standard now concerning foreign trade. For instance, compare the two paragraphs below, the one found in 1874 in the Derrick, the second in a Defense of the Oil Trust published in 1900. 1874. It lights the dwellings, the temples, and the mosques amid the ruins of ancient Babylon and Nineveh. It is the light of Baghdad, the city of the 1,001 nights, of Orpha, birthplace of Abraham, of Mardin, the ancient Massius of the Romans, and of Damascus, gem of the Orient. It burns in the grotto of the Nativity at Bethlehem, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, amidst the pyramids of Egypt, on the Acropolis of Athens, on the plains of Troy, and in cottage and palace on the banks of the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn. 1900. Petroleum today is the light of the world. It is carried wherever a wheel can roll or a camel's hoof be planted. The caravans on the desert of Sahara go laden with Pratt's Astral, and elephants in India carry cases of Standard White, while ships are constantly loading at our wharves for Japan, Java, and the most distant isles of the sea. Exports grew rapidly through the same machinery which had created the foreign market. In 1870 there was something over 140 million gallons of petroleum products going abroad. In 1873 nearly 2.5 million. In 1878 3.5 million. In 1870 the Standard began its work on the foreign trade by sending a representative abroad. Country after country seems to have been taken up, the idea being that the daily Standard Oil meeting should have the same full information before it concerning every place of foreign trade as it had of the American trade, and that gradually the company should control the foreign trade as it did the American industry, doing away with middlemen, paying nobody a profit. This work, begun in 1879, has been carried on steadily ever since. Through it the Standard soon became largely its own exporter. It established stations of its own in one port after another of Europe, Asia, South America, and has built up a large oil fleet. It carried on an aggressive campaign for developing markets. It looked after hostile legislation. It studied the possible competition of native oils. It met every difficulty, prejudice, ignorance, and poverty. Little by little it has done in foreign countries what it has done in the United States. To day it even carts oil from door to door in Germany and Portugal and other countries, as it does in America, thus realising Mr. Rockefeller's vision of controlling the petroleum of America from the time it leaves the ground until it is put into the lamp of the consumer. The same economy and alertness were applied to the matter of making oils. In laying hands on the refineries of the country, Rockefeller had acquired by 1882 about all the processes of manufacturing known, both patented and free. These processes, including all the essential ones of to day, had been developed entirely outside of the Standard Oil Company. As early as 1865, the year Mr. Rockefeller went into the business, William Wright wrote an exhaustive book on the oil regions of Pennsylvania. Among other things, he reported quite fully what was being done in the refining of petroleum. He found that in several factories they were making naphtha, gasoline, and benzine; that 3 grades of illuminating oils, prime white, standard white, and straw colour, were made everywhere; that paraffin, refined to a pure white article like that of to day, was manufactured in quantities by the Downer works, and that lubricating oils were beginning to be made. In 1872, the year that Mr. Rockefeller took things in hand, all of these original products had been greatly extended, as we have seen. Joshua Merrill had succeeded in deodorizing lubricating oil, making it possible to put the petroleum lubricants on the foreign market, and in 1871 Mr. Merrill's factories sold 50,000 gallons in England alone. By 1872 paraffin wax was being made in many factories, and one maker of chewing gum in Maine used 70,000 pounds that year. The foreign trade in all the products of petroleum outside of illuminating oil was already considerable. Many of the factories in making their oils gave them names. Thus Pratt's Astral was a name for a water white oil made by the Pratt Works of Brooklyn. It was a high grade oil, made exactly as the oil made by many other refineries, but it had a name, a valuable one. The tables on pages 246 and 247, analysing the products of crude oil obtained to day at the Standard factories, show the results tabulated. Now all of the products in these groups could be made in 1872, but certainly there were not 46 distinct products under the naphthas as the table shows, nor were there 174 refined distillates. In fact, these are not really products, they are rather brands. Thus, though the table shows 29 different kinds of odorized or deodorized naphthas, the main difference between them is their name. The 174 refined distillates, which really are the different grades of illuminating oil which any factory can get, given the proper crude base, with a multitude of different names applied to catch the trade. Thus, among the 174 products are 33 kinds of Standard white oil and 41 kinds of water white, the principal difference between them being the different fire tests at which they are put out. The real service of the Standard has been not this multiplication of so-called products, but in finding processes by which a poor oil like the famous Lima oil could be refined. In the case of the Lima oil, the Standard claims it spent millions of dollars before it solved the problem of its usefulness. The amount of sulphur in the Lima or Ohio oil prevented its use as an illuminating oil, for the odour was intolerable, there was a disagreeable smoke, and the wick charred rapidly. The problem of deodorizing it was attacked by many experimenters, and was finally practically solved by the Frasch process, which the Standard acquired after spending a large amount of money in testing its efficacy. Probably 60% of the illuminating oil used in the United States now is manufactured from an Ohio oil base. This multiplication of varieties is, of course, a perfectly legitimate merchandising device, but it is not a development of products, properly speaking. Nor indeed was it for discoveries and inventions that the Standard Oil Trust was great in 1882, or that it is now. It is in the way it adapts and handles the discoveries and inventions it acquires. Take the matter of lubricating oils. After a long struggle, it gathered to itself the factories and the patents of lubricating oils, and it has developed the trade amazingly. For while in 1872 less than 500,000 gallons of petroleum lubricants were going abroad, in 1897 over 50,000,000 gallons went. The extension of the lubricating trade was made possible by the discovery of Mr. Merrill, referred to above. In 1869 Mr. Merrill discovered a process by which a deodorized lubricating oil could be made. He had both the apparatus for producing the oil and for the oil itself patented. The oil was so favourably received that the market sale was several hundred per cent greater in a single year than the firm had ever sold before. Naturally, an attempt was made by other lubricating works to imitate Mr. Merrill's new product. The most successful imitation was made by Dr. S. D. Tweedle of Pittsburgh. The oil he put upon the market was considered an infringement by Mr. Merrill, who commenced suit against the agents handling it. The case was before the courts for some 6 years, and Mr. Merrill spent over $100,000 in maintaining the patent. The case was finally decided in his favor by the Supreme Court in Washington. During this suit the Standard Oil Company stood behind Dr. Tweedle, furnishing the money to defend the suit. When finally they were defeated, they took a license under the new patent which Mr. Merrill was obliged to get out, and paid him a royalty on the oil until within about a year and a half before the end of the life of the patent, when they bought it outright for a large sum, Mr. Merrill reserving the right to manufacture and sell the oil without a royalty. Most lubricating oils from petroleum are now made after Mr. Merrill's process. Having obtained control of the lubricating oils, the Standard showed the greatest intelligence in studying the markets and in developing the products. It makes lubricants for every machine that works. It offers scores of cylinder oils, scores of spindle lubricants, of valve lubricants, of gas engine lubricants, special brands for sewing machines, for looms, for sole leather, for dynamos, for marine engines, for everything that runs and works by steam power, by air, by electricity, by gas, by man, or by beast power. Now any lubricating factory can produce the 6 or 8 primary lubricants. Given these, the varieties to be produced by skillful compounding are infinite. They can be made more or less viscous, flowing, heavy, light, according to the needs of the machines and the idiosyncrasies of individuals who run them. The man who runs a machine soon knows what oil suits him, and if his trade is big enough, an oil is put up especially for him with a name to tickle his vanity. It may be exactly like a dozen other oils on the market, but having its own name it is reckoned a new product. Skillful compounders insist that they can duplicate any of the 833 lubricating oils of the Standard if they can have samples. Of course, this close study of the needs of a market and this adaptation of one's goods to the requirements are the highest sort of merchandising. Unquestionably, the great strength of the Standard Trust in 1882, when it was founded as it is today, was the men who formed it. However sweeping Mr. Rockefeller's commercial vision, however steady his purpose, however remarkable his insight into what was essential to the realization of his ambition, he would have never gone far had he not drawn men into his concern who understood what he was after and knew how to work for it. His principle concerning men was laid down early. We want only the big ones, those who have already proved they can do a big business. As for the others, unfortunately, they will have to die. The scheme had no provision for mediocrity, nor for those who could not stomach his methods. The men who in 1882 formed the Standard Alliance were all from the foremost rank in the petroleum trade, men who, without question, would be among those at the top to day if there had never been a Standard Oil Company. In Pittsburgh it was Charles Lockhart, a man interested in petroleum before the Drake well was struck, who had begun oil operations at Oil Creek in March, 1860, who had carried samples of crude and refined to Europe as early as May, 1860, who had built one of the first refineries in Pittsburgh, and who was easily the largest refiner there in 1874, when Mr. Rockefeller bought him up. In Philadelphia, the largest refiner in 1874 was W. G. Warden, of the Atlantic Refining Company, and it was he whom Mr. Rockefeller wanted. In New York it was the concern of Charles Pratt and Company, one of the three largest concerns around Manhattan, the concern to which H. Rogers belonged. Charles Pratt had been in the oil and paint business since 1850, and he had become a refiner of petroleum at Greenpoint, Long Island, in 1867. Before Standard Oil was known outside New York, the fame of Pratt's Astral Oil had gone around the world. Mr. Pratt's concern was rated at the same daily capacity as Mr. Rockefeller's, 1,500 barrels, in the spring of 1872, when the latter wiped up the Cleveland refineries and grew in a night to 10,000 barrels. Mr. Vandergrift, who united his interests with Mr. Rockefeller's in 1874 and 1875, had been a far better known man in the oil business and controlled much greater and more varied interests up to South Improvement times. When he went into the Standard, he controlled the largest refinery on Oil Creek, the Imperial, of about 1,400 barrels. He was president of a large system of pipe lines, and he was a member of one of the largest oil producing concerns of the time, the H. L. Taylor Company. There is no doubt but that Mr. Rockefeller had plenty of brains in his great trust. It was those who had done business with him who were the first to point this out when critics declared that the concern could not, or must not, live. There is no question about it, W. H. Vanderbilt told the Hepburn Commission in 1879, but these men are smarter than I am a great deal. They are very enterprising and smart men. I never came in contact with any class of men as smart and as able as they are in their business. They would never have got into the position they now are without a great deal of ability, and one man would hardly have been able to do it. It is a combination of men. It was not only that first-rate ability was demanded at the top, it was required throughout the organization. The very day laborers were picked men. It was the custom to offer a little better day wages for laborers than was current, and then to choose from these the most promising specimens. Those men were advanced as they showed ability. Today the very errand boys at 26 Broadway are chosen for the promise of development they show, and if they do not develop, they are discharged. No dead wood is taken into the concern unless it is through the supposed necessities of family or business relations, as probably occurs to a degree in every human organization. The efficiency of the working force of the Standard was greatly increased when the trust was formed by the opportunity given to the employees of taking stock. They were urged to do it, and where they had no savings, money was lent them on easy terms by the company. The result is that a great number of the employees of the Standard Oil Company are owners of stock which they bought at 80, and on which for several years they have received from 30 to 48% dividends. It is only natural that under such circumstances the company has always a remarkably loyal and interested working force. Mr. Rockefeller's great creation has really been strong, then, in many admirable qualities. The force of the combination has been greater because of the business habits of the independent body which has opposed it. To the Standard's caution, the Oil Regions opposed recklessness; to its economy, extravagance; to its secretiveness, almost blatant frankness; to its far-sightedness, little thought of the morrow; to its close-fistedness, a spendthrift generosity; to its selfish unscrupulousness, an almost quixotic love of fair play. The Oil Regions had, besides, one fatal weakness, its passion for speculation. Now, Mr. Rockefeller never speculates. He deals only in those things which other people have proved sure. It is when one examines the inside of the Standard Oil Trust that one sees how much reason there is for the opinion of those people who declare that Mr. Rockefeller can always sustain the monopoly of the oil business he has achieved. One begins to see what Mr. Vanderbilt meant in 1879 when he said, "I don't believe that by any legislative enactment or anything else, through any of the states or all of the states, you can keep such men down. You can't do it. They will be on top all the time. You see if they are not." It is not surprising that those who realize the compactness and harmony of the Standard organisation, the ability of its members, The solidity of the qualities governing its operations are willing to forget its history. Such is the blinding quality of success. It has achieved this, they say. No matter what helped to rear this structure, it is here. It is admirably managed. We might as well accept it. We must do business. They are weary of contention, too. Who so unwelcome as an agitator? And they began to accept the Standard's explanation that the critics are indeed people with a private grievance, mossbacks left behind in the march of progress. Again and again in the history of the oil business it has looked to the outsider as if henceforth Mr. Rockefeller would have to have things his own way. For who was there to interfere with him, to dispute his position? No one, save that back in northwestern Pennsylvania, in scrubby little oil towns, around greasy derricks, in dingy shanties, by rusty, deserted oil stills, men have always talked of the iniquity of the railroad rebate, the injustice of restraint of trade, the dangers of monopoly, the right to do an independent business, have always rehearsed with tiresome persistency the evidence by which it has been proved that the Standard Oil Company is a revival of the South Improvement Company. It has all seemed futile enough, with the public listening in wonder and awe to the splendid rehearsal of figures and the unctuous logic of the mother of trust, and yet one can never tell. It was the squawking of geese that saved the Capitol. Certain it is that many and great as are his business qualities, John D. Rockefeller has never been allowed to enjoy the fruits of his victory in that atmosphere of leisure and adulation which the victor naturally craves. Certain it is that the incessant agitation of men with a private grievance has ruined some of his fairest schemes, has hauled him again and again before investigating committees, and has contributed greatly to securing a federal law authorizing so fundamental and obvious a right as equal rates on common carriers. Certain it is that the incessant efforts of those who believed they had a right to do an independent business have resulted in the most important advances made in the oil business since the beginning of Mr. Rockefeller's combination, namely the seaboard pipe line for transporting crude oil due to the Tidewater Pipe Line, and later the use of the seaboard pipe line for transporting refined oil due to the United States Pipe Line. Certain it is, too, that all of competition which we have, with its consequent lowering of prices, is due to independent efforts. This is the end of Chapter 17. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 18 of The History of Standard Oil, Volume 2 by Ida Tarbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 18. Conclusion. Few men in either the political or industrial life of this country can point to an achievement carried out in more exact accord with its first conception than John D. Rockefeller. For both in purpose and methods the Standard Oil Company is, and always has been, a form of the South Improvement Company, by which Mr. Rockefeller first attracted general attention in the oil industry. The original scheme has suffered many modifications. Its most offensive feature, the drawback on other people's shipments, has been cut off. Nevertheless, today, as at the start, the purpose of the Standard Oil Company is the purpose of the South Improvement Company, the regulation of the price of crude and refined oil by the control of the output, and the chief means for sustaining this purpose is still that of the original scheme, a control of oil transportation giving special privileges in rates. It is now 32 years since Mr. Rockefeller applied the fruitful idea of the South Improvement Company to the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, a prosperous oil refinery of Cleveland with a capital of $1 million and a daily capacity for handling 1,500 barrels of crude oil. And what have we as a result? What is the Standard Oil Company today? First, what is its organization? It is no longer a trust. As we have seen, the trust was obliged to liquidate in 1892. It became a trust in liquidation, and there it remained for some 5 years. It seemed to have come into a state of stationary liquidation, for at the end of 1892 477,881 shares were uncancelled. At the end of 1896 the same number were out. The situation of the great corporation was indeed curious. There began to be comments on it, for complications arose, one over taxes. In 1893 an auditor in Ohio tried to collect taxes on 225 shares of the Standard Oil Trust. The owner refused to pay and took the case into court. He won it. "The Standard Oil Trust is an unlawful organisation," said the court. "Its certificates have no validity." It would seem strange that a certificate which was void to all purpose would still be valid as to taxable purposes. Here was an anomaly indeed. The certificates were drawing big quarterly dividends, had a big market value, but were illegal. Owners of small certificates naturally refused to exchange. In 1897 it took 194½ shares of the Standard Oil Trust to bring back 1 share in each of the 20 companies. Thus 1 share in the Standard Oil Company of Ohio was worth 27 shares in the Standard Oil Trust. If a man owned 25 shares, he got only fractional parts of a share in each company. On these fractional parts he received no dividends, it not being considered practical to consider such small sums. To raise his 25 shares to 194 and so secure dividends took a good sum of money, since Standard Oil Trust shares were worth at least $3.40 then. But why should he trouble? He received his quarterly dividends promptly, and they were large. He paid no taxes, for his stock was illegal. The trustees were not pushing him to liquidate. Besides, it was doubtful if they could do anything. Joseph Choate said they could not. On May 3, 1894, before the Attorney General of New York, in an application for the forfeiture of the charter of the Standard Oil Company of New York, Mr. Choate said: "I happen to own 100 shares in the Standard Oil Trust, and I have never gone forward and claimed my aliquot share. Why not? Because I would get 10 in one company, and 10 in another company, and 2 3/5 in another company. There is no power that this company can exercise to compel me and other indifferent certificate holders, if you please, to come forward and convert our trust certificates." If there was a way, the trustees were indifferent to it. They evidently were contented to let things alone. It is quite possible that they would have been holding to day 477,881 uncancelled shares of Standard Oil Trust if it had not been for the irrepressible George Rice. Since October, 1892, Mr. Rice had held a Standard Oil Trust certificate for 6 shares. He had never cancelled it. He had received no invitation to do so. He received his dividends regularly on it. Later he purchased 1 share, called assignment of legal title, the new form given the trust certificate, and on this he received dividends exactly as on the original trust certificate. Finally Mr. Rice made up his mind, without knowing any of the facts of the liquidation outlined above, that there was no intention to carry out the dissolution, that some means of evasion had been devised, and he proposed to find out what it was. To do this he transferred his assignment of legal title to an agent with the order to liquidate it. A long correspondence followed between Mr. Kemper, Mr. Rice's agent, and Mr. Dodd, who objected to making the transfer on the ground that it cut the share into a multitude of almost infinitesimal fractions of corporate shares. They were obviating this difficulty, Mr. Dodd said, by purchasing certificates calling for 1 or a few shares and uniting them until sufficient were had by one party to call for the issue of full corporate shares. Mr. Kemper insisted, however, and finally received scrip for his share. Infinitesimal it was, indeed 5,000 over 972,500 of 1 share in one company, 10,000 over 922,500 of another share in another, and so on through 19 constituent companies. Arguing from these experiences and what else he could gather, Mr. Rice decided that the trust was not dissolved and had no intention of doing so. Further, he argued that the scheme was one to entice the small shareholders to sell their shares and thus enable the trustees to increase their holdings. And he sought legal counsel in Ohio as to the possibility of bringing suit against the Standard Oil Company of Ohio for failing to obey the court's orders in March, 1892. The attorneys, one of whom was Mr. Watson, advised Mr. Rice to lay his facts before the attorney general of the state, Frank S. Monnett. Like Mr. Watson, when he brought his suit, Mr. Monnett was young and held firmly to the belief that the business of an attorney general is to enforce the laws. The facts Mr. Rice and his counsel laid before him seemed to him to indicate that the Standard Oil Company of Ohio had taken advantage of the leniency of the court in allowing it time to disentangle itself from the trust, and had devised a skilful plan to evade the judgment pronounced against it 5 years before. He asked Mr. Rice and his attorneys to go with him and lay the case before the judges of the Supreme Court in chambers, and asked if it did not justify proceedings against the Standard. The judges agreed with the attorney general and ordered him to bring the company before the court for contempt. Information was filed in November, 1897. The suit which followed proved one of the most sensational ever instituted against the Standard Oil Combination. The first substantial point gained by the attorney general in the proceedings were securing answers to a long series of questions concerning the history of the operations of the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, both within and without the trust. These answers were made by the president of that company, who was at the same time the president of the trust, John D. Rockefeller. They furnish a mass of facts of value and interest, and they include the minutes of the meeting at which the trust was dissolved on March 11, 1892, as well as the minutes of all the quarterly meetings the liquidating trustees held from 1892 to October, 1897. It was from the information obtained from this set of questions that Mr. Monnett secured proof that the liquidation scheme had been held up, as Mr. Rice claimed. The minutes showed, as related in Chapter 14, that from November, 1892 to March, 1896, 477,881 shares were reported every 3 months to the trustees as uncancelled. In July, 1896, the number fell suddenly to 477,880. George Rice had succeeded in having his assignment of legal title liquidated. Mr. Monnett learned from the result of this inquiry another suggestive fact, that while only one share was cancelled in the 5 years before the contempt proceedings were brought, in the first 3 months after, 100,583 shares were cancelled. It took Mr. Monnett some 6 months to secure the answers from Mr. Rockefeller, but his information was still incomplete, and he asked the court to appoint a master commissioner, with power to examine the officers, affairs and books of the Standard, to take testimony within or without the state, and to report. This was done, the commissioner holding his first court at the New Amsterdam Hotel in New York on October 11 and 12, 1898. Mr. Rockefeller was the only witness examined at the sessions, and his deliberation and self-control, his almost detached attitude as a witness, were the subject of remark by more than one observer. He answered no question promptly. He had the air of reflecting always before he spoke. He consulted frequently with his counsel. His counsel, his colleagues who were present, the counsel of the prosecution, were sometimes irate. Never Mr. Rockefeller. From beginning to end he was the soul of self-possession. His only sign of impatience, if it was impatience, was an incessant slight tapping of the arm of his chair with his white fingers. The outcome of this examination of Mr. Rockefeller was that Mr. Monnett and his colleagues called for those books of the trust which would show exactly how the original trust certificates had been liquidated. It was then that the copies of the transfers of Mr. Rockefeller's trust certificates and of his assignments of legal title printed in the Appendix No. 54 were obtained. Although Mr. Monnett had added to his knowledge of the Standard's operations between 1892 and 1898, he was not yet convinced that the Standard Oil Company of Ohio was conducting its own business. He had found that, in spite of the order of the court in 1892, 13,593 shares of that company's stock were still outstanding in trust certificates. He knew these certificates drew dividends. Was the company paying money directly or indirectly to the liquidating trustees? They said no, that they had been paying no dividends since 1892, that the money paid the holders of trust certificates came from the 19 other companies, that all their earnings had been used in improving their plant or were invested in government bonds. Besides, said they, we are not the thrifty concern we used to be. Mr. Monnett demanded proof from their books. The secretary of the company, on advice of his counsel, Virgil P. Kline, refused to produce the books asked for, on the ground that they would incriminate the company. The court supported Mr. Monnett and ordered the company to produce those of their records showing the gross earnings since 1892, and what had been done with them. The order met with a second refusal. Such was the status of the proceedings when Mr. Monnett received an anonymous communication stating that, about the time the company was ordered by the court to produce its records, a great quantity of books had been taken from the Standard's office in Cleveland and burned. An investigation was made at once by the attorney general, and a number of witnesses examined. The fact of the burning of 16 boxes of books from the Standard offices in Cleveland was established, but these books, the officers of the company contended, were not the ones wanted by Mr. Monnett. Then produce the ones we want, ordered the court. But on the ground that such records might incriminate them, the officers still refused. The fact was, the Standard Oil Company of Ohio was in a very tight place, and it is difficult to see how an examination of their books could have failed to incriminate not only it, but 3 other of the constituent companies of the trust which held charters from the same state. These 3 companies were the Ohio Oil Company, which produced oil, the Buckeye Pipe Line, which transported it, and the Solar Refining Company, which refined it. Mr. Monnett had learned enough about these organisations in the course of his investigations since November, 1897, to convince him that these companies, all of them enormously profitable, were, for all practical purposes, one and the same combination, and that they were all working with the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, and that their operations were in direct violation of a state antitrust law recently passed. As soon as he had sufficient evidence he had filed petitions against all 4 of them. Now these petitions were filed about the time he demanded the books showing the earnings of the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, for use in his contempt case. It was the old story of one suit being used as a shield in another. A witness cannot be made to incriminate himself. The reasons F. B. Squire, the secretary of the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, gave for refusing to produce the books as ordered by the court were as follows: First, because they are demanded in an action instituted against the Standard Oil Company for contempt of court, and for the purpose of proving said company guilty of contempt, in order that the penalties for contempt may be inflicted upon it and its officers. And I am informed that to enforce their production in such a case and for such a purpose is an unreasonable search and seizure. Second, because the books disclose facts and circumstances which may be used against the Standard Oil Company, tending to prove it guilty of offences made criminal by an act of the Legislature of Ohio passed April 19, 1898, entitled "An Act to Define Trusts and to Provide for Criminal Penalties, Civil Damages, and the Punishment of Corporations," etc. Third, because they disclose facts and circumstances which may be used against myself personally as an officer of said company, tending to prove me guilty of offences made criminal by the act aforesaid. All through the winter of 1898 and 1899, up to the end of March, when the Commission declared the taking of testimony closed, the wrangle over the production of the books went on. Depositions had begun to be taken at the same time in the cases against the constituent companies for violation of the antitrust laws, and by the time the contempt case was closed in March, 1899, the exasperation of both sides had reached fever pitch. Nor did the judgment of the court quiet it, for 3 judges voted for finding the company guilty of contempt, and 3 for clearing it. Unsatisfactory as this was, Mr. Monnett had his antitrust suits, through which he expected, and through which he did secure, much further evidence that the 4 Standard companies in Ohio were practically one concern so shrewdly and secretly handled that they were evading not only the laws of the state, but that policy of all states which decrees that it is unsafe to allow men to work together in industrial combinations without charters defining their privileges and subjecting them to reasonable examinations and publicity. Mr. Monnett's work on these suits came to an end with the expiration of his term in January, 1900, and the suits were suppressed by his successor John N. sheets. Unfinished as they were of the greatest value in dragging into the light information concerning the methods and operations of the Standard Oil Combination to which the public has the right, and which it must digest if it is to succeed in working out a legal harness for combinations like the Standard demand freedom to do what they like and do it secretly. The only refuge offered in the United States for the Standard Oil Trust in 1898, when the possibility arose by these suits of the state of Ohio taking away the charters of 4 of its most important constituent companies for contempt of court and violation of the antitrust laws of the state, lay in the corporation law of the state of New Jersey, which had just been amended, and here it settled. Among the 20 companies which formed the trust was the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, a corporation for manufacturing and marketing petroleum products. Its capital was $10,000,000. In June, 1899, this capital of $10,000,000 was increased to one of $110,000,000, and into this new organisation was dumped the entire Standard aggregation. The old trust certificates outstanding and the assignments of legal title which had succeeded them were called in, and for them were given common stock of the new Standard Oil Company. The amount of this stock which had been issued in January, 1904, when the last report was made, was $97,448,800. Its market value at that date was $643,162,080. How it is divided is, of course, a matter of private concern. The number of stockholders in 1899 was about 3,500, according to Mr. Archbold's testimony to the Interstate Commerce Commission, but over one half of the stock was owned by the directors, and probably nearly one third was owned by Mr. Rockefeller himself. The companies which this new Standard Oil Company has bought up with its stock are numerous and scattered. They consist of oil producing companies like the South Penn Oil Company, the Ohio Oil Company, and the Forest Oil Company; of transporting companies like the National Transit Company, the Buckeye Pipe Line Company, the Indiana Pipe Line Company, and the Eureka Pipe Line Company; of manufacturing and marketing companies like the Atlantic Refining Company of Pennsylvania and the Standard Oil Company of many states, New York, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, Iowa; of foreign marketing concerns like the Anglo American Company. In 1892 there were 20 of these constituent companies. There have been many added since, in whole or part, like gas companies; new producing concerns made necessary by developments in California, Kansas, and Texas; new marketing concerns for handling oil directly in Germany, Italy, Scandinavia, and Portugal. What the total value of the companies owned by the present Standard Oil Company is, it is impossible to say. In 1892, when the trust was on trial in Ohio, it reported the aggregate capital of its 20 companies as $102,233,700, and the appraised value was given as $121,631,312.63. That is, there was an excess of about $19,000,000. In 1898, when Attorney General Monnett of Ohio had the Standard Oil Company of the state on trial for contempt of court, he tried to find out from Mr. Rockefeller what the surplus of each of the various companies in the trust was at that date. Mr. Rockefeller answered, "I have not in my possession or power data showing the amount of such surplus money in their hands after the payment of the last dividends." Then Mr. Rockefeller proceeded to repeat as the last he knew of the value of the holdings of the trust the list of values given 6 years before. This list has continued to be cited ever since as authoritative. There is a later one, whether Mr. Rockefeller had it in his possession or power or not, in 1898. It is the last trustworthy valuation of which the writer knows, and is found in testimony taken in 1899 in a private suit to which Mr. Rockefeller was party. It is for the year 1896. This shows the total capital and surplus of the 20 companies to have been, on December 31 of that year, something over $147,000,000, nearly 49 millions of which was scheduled as undivided profits. Of course there has been a constant increase in value since 1896. The new Standard Oil Company is managed by a board of 14 directors. They probably collect the dividends of the constituent companies and divide them among stockholders in exactly the same way the trustees of 1882 and the liquidating trustees of 1892 did. As for the charter under which they are operating, never since the days of the South Improvement Company has Mr. Rockefeller held privileges so in harmony with his ambition. By it he can do all kinds of mining, manufacturing and trading business, transport goods and merchandise by land and water in any manner, buy, sell, lease and improve lands, build houses, structures, vessels, cars, wharves, docks and piers, lay and operate pipe lines, erect and operate telegraph and telephone lines, and lines for conducting electricity, enter into and carry out contracts of every kind pertaining to his business, acquire, use, sell and grant licenses under patent rights, purchase or otherwise acquire, hold, sell, assign and transfer shares of capital stock in bonds or other evidences of indebtedness of corporations, and exercise all the privileges of ownership, including voting upon the stock so held, carry on its business and have offices and agencies therefore in all parts of the world, and hold, purchase, mortgage and convey real estate and personal property outside the state of New Jersey. These privileges are, of course, subject to the laws of the state or country in which the company operates. If it is contrary to the laws of a state for a foreign corporation to hold real estate in its boundaries, a company must be chartered in the state. Its stock, of course, is sold to the New Jersey corporation, so that it amounts to the same thing as far as the ability to do business is concerned. It will be seen that this really amounts to a special charter allowing the holder not only to do all that is specified, but to create whatever other power it desires, except banking. A comparison of this summary of powers with those granted by the South Improvement Company shows that in sweep of charter at least, the Standard Oil Company of to day has as great power as its famous progenitor. The profits of the present Standard Oil Company are enormous. For 5 years the dividends have been averaging about $45,000,000 a year, or nearly 50 per cent on its capitalization, a sum which capitalized at 5 per cent would give $900,000,000. Of course, this is not all that the combination makes in a year. It allows an annual average of 5.77 per cent for deficit, and it carries always an ample reserve fund. When we remember that probably 1/3 of this immense annual revenue goes into the hands of John D. Rockefeller, that probably 90 per cent of it goes to the few men who make up the Standard Oil family, and that it must every year be invested, the Standard Oil becomes a much more serious public matter than it was in 1872, when it stamped itself as willing to enter into a conspiracy to raid the oil business, as a much more serious concern than in the years when it openly made warfare of business, and drove from the oil industry by any means it could invent all who had the hardihood to enter it. For consider what must be done with the greater part of this $45,000,000. It must be invested. The oil business does not demand it. There is plenty of reserve for all its ventures. It must go into other industries. Naturally the interests sought will be allied to oil. They will be gas, and we will have the Standard Oil crowd steadily acquiring the gas interests of the country. They will be railroads, for on transportation all industries depend, and besides, railroads are one of the great consumers of oil products, and must be kept in line as buyers. And we have the directors of the Standard Oil Company acting as directors on nearly all of the great railways of the country, the New York Central, New York, New Haven and Hartford, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, Union Pacific, Northern Pacific, Delaware, Lackawanna and Western, Missouri Pacific, Missouri, Kansas and Texas, Boston and Maine, and other lesser roads. They will go into copper, and we have the amalgamated scheme. They will go into steel, and we have Mr. Rockefeller's enormous holdings in the Steel Trust. They will go into banking, and we have the National City Bank and its allied institutions in New York City and Boston, as well as a long chain running over the country. No one who has followed this history can expect these holdings will be acquired on a rising market. Buy cheap and sell high is a rule of business. And when you control enough money and enough banks, you can always manage that a stock you want shall be temporarily cheap. No value is destroyed for you, only for the original owner. This has been one of Mr. Rockefeller's most successful manoeuvres in doing business from the day he scared his 20 Cleveland competitors until they sold to him at half price. You can also sell high if you have a reputation of a great financier and control of money in banks. Amalgamated Copper is an excellent example. The names of certain Standard Oil officials would float the most worthless property on earth a few years ago. It might be a little difficult for them to do so to day with Amalgamated so fresh in mind. Indeed, Amalgamated seems to day to be the worst break, as it certainly was one of the most outrageous performances of the Standard Oil crowd. But that will soon be forgotten. The result is that the Standard Oil Company is probably in the strongest financial position of any aggregation in the world. And every year its position grows stronger, for every year there is pouring in another $45,000,000 to be used in wiping up the property most essential to preserving and broadening its power. And now, what does the law of New Jersey require the concern which it has chartered, and which is so rapidly adding to its control of oil the control of iron, steel, copper, banks, and railroads, to make known of itself? It must each year report its name, the location of its registration office, with name of agent, the character of its business, the amount of capital stock issued, and the names and addresses of its officers and directors. So much for present organisation. And now as to how far through this organisation the Standard Oil Company is able to realise the purpose for which it is organised, the control of the output, and through that the price, of refined oil. That is, what per cent of the whole oil business does Mr. Rockefeller's concern control? First, as to oil production. In 1898 the Standard Oil Company reported to the Industrial Commission that it produced 35.58 per cent of Eastern crude. The production that year was about 52,000,000 barrels. It should be remembered that it is always to the Eastern oil fields, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, that this narrative refers. Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and California are newer developments. These fields have not as yet been determining factors in the business, though Texas particularly has been a distributing factor. But while Mr. Rockefeller produces only about a third of the entire production, he controls all but about 10 per cent of it. That is, all but about 10 per cent goes immediately into his custody on coming from the wells. It passes entirely out of the hands of the producers when the Standard Pipe Line takes it. The oil is in Mr. Rockefeller's hands, and he, not the producer, can decide who is to have it. The greater portion of it he takes himself, of course, for he is the chief refiner of the country. In 1898 there were about 24,000,000 barrels of petroleum products made in this country. Of this amount about 20,000,000 were made by the Standard Oil Company. Fully a third of the balance was produced by the Tidewater Company, of which the Standard holds a large minority stock, and which for 20 years has had a running arrangement with the Standard. Reckoning out the Tidewater's probable output, and we have an independent output of about 2,500,000 in 24,000,000. It is obvious that this great percentage of the business gives the Standard the control of prices. This control can be kept in the domestic market so long as the Standard can keep under competition as successfully as it has in the past. It can be kept in the foreign market as long as American oils can be made and sold in quantity cheaper than foreign oils. Until a decade ago the foreign market of American oils was not seriously threatened. Since 1895, however, Russia, whose annual output of petroleum had been for a number of years about equal in volume to the American output, learned to make a fairly decent product. More dangerous, she had learned to market. She first appeared in Europe in 1885. It took 10 years to make her a formidable rival, but she is so to day, and in spite of temporary alliances and combinations, it is very doubtful whether the Standard will ever permanently control Russian oil. In 1899 Mr. Archbold presented to the Industrial Commission a most interesting list of foreign corporations and individuals doing an oil business in various countries. According to this there were more than a score of large concerns in Russia, and many small ones. The aggregate capitalization shown by Mr. Archbold's list was over 46.5 millions, and the capitalization of a number of the concerns named was not given. In Galicia, 4 companies with an aggregate capital of $3,775,100, and in Romania 6 large companies with an aggregate capital of $12,500,000 were reported. Borneo was shown to have nearly 3 millions invested in the oil fields. Sumatra and Java each over 12 millions. Since this report was made these companies have grown, particularly in marketing ability. In the East the oil market belonged practically to the Standard Oil Company until recently. Last year, 1903, however, Sumatra imported more oil into China than America, and Russia imported nearly half as much. About 91,500 gallons of kerosene went into Calcutta last year, and of this only about 6,000,000 gallons came from America. In Singapore, representatives of Sumatra Oil claim they have 2/3 of the trade. Combinations for offensive and defensive trade campaigns have also gone on energetically among these various companies in the last few years. One of the largest and most powerful of these aggregations now at work is in connection with an English shipping concern, the Shell Transport and Trading Company, the head of which is Sir Marcus Samuel, formerly Lord Mayor of London. This company, which formerly traded almost entirely in Russian oil, undertook a few years ago to develop the oil fields in Borneo, and they built up a large Oriental trade. They soon came into hot competition with the Royal Dutch Company, handling Sumatra oil, and a war of prices ensued which lasted nearly 2 years. In 1903, however, the 2 competitors, in connection with 4 other strong Sumatra and European companies, drew up an agreement in regard to markets which has put an end to their war. The Shell people have not only these allies, but they have a contract with the Guffey Petroleum Company, the largest Texas producing concern, to handle its output, and they have gone into a German company, the Petroleum Produkten Aktiengesellschaft. Having thus provided themselves with a supply they have begun developing a European trade on the same lines as their Oriental trade, and they are making serious inroads on the Standard's market. The naphthas made from the Borneo oil have largely taken the place of American naphtha in many parts of Europe. One load of Borneo benzine even made its appearance in the American market in 1904. It is a sign of what well may happen in the future with an intelligent development of these Russian and Oriental oils. The Standard's domestic market invaded. It will be interesting to see what further extent the American government will protect the Standard Oil Company by tariff on foreign oils if such a time does come. It has done very well already. The aggressive marketing of the Shell and its allies in Europe has led to a recent oil war of great magnitude. For several months in 1904 American export oil was sold at a lower price in New York than the crude oil it takes to make it cost there. For instance, on August 13, 1904, the New York export price was 4.8 cents per gallon for Standard White in bulk. Crude sold at the well for $1.50 a barrel of 42 gallons, and it cost 60 cents to get it to seaboard by pipeline. That is, 42 gallons of crude oil cost $2.10, or 5 cents a gallon in New York, 20 points lost on a gallon of the raw material. But this low price for export affects the local market little or none. The tank wagon price keeps up to 10 and 11 cents in New York. Of course, crude is depressed as much as possible to help carry this competition. For many months now there has been the abnormal situation of a declining crude price in the face of declining stocks. The truth is, the Standard Oil Company is trying to meet the competition of the low grade Oriental and Russian oils with high grade American oil, the crude being kept as low as possible and the domestic market being made to pay for the foreign cutting. It seems a lack of foresight surprising in the Standard to have allowed itself to be found in such a dilemma. Certainly for over 2 years the company has been making every effort to escape by getting hold of a supply of low grade oil which would enable it to meet the competition of the foreigner. There have been more or less short lived arrangements in Russia. An oil territory in Galicia was secured not long ago by them, and an expert refiner with a full refining plant was sent over. Various hindrances have been met in the undertaking, and the works are not yet in operation. 2 years ago the Standard attempted to get hold of the rich Burma oil fields. The press of India fought them out of the country, and their weapon was the Standard Oil Company's own record for hard dealings. The Burma fields are in the hands of a monopoly of the closest sort which has never properly developed the territory, but the people and government prefer their own monopoly to one of the American type. Altogether, the most important question concerning the Standard Oil Company to day is how far it is sustaining its power by the employment of the peculiar methods of the South Improvement Company. It should never be forgotten that Mr. Rockefeller never depended on these methods alone for securing power in the oil trade. From the beginning, the Standard Oil Company has studied thoroughly everything connected with the oil business. It has known, not guessed at conditions. It has had a keen, authoritative sight. It has applied itself to its task with indefatigable zeal. It has been as courageous as it has been cautious. Nothing has been too big to undertake, as nothing has been too small to neglect. These facts have been repeatedly pointed out in this narrative. But these are the American industrial qualities. They are common enough in all sorts of business. They have made our railroads, built up our great department stores, opened our mines. The Standard Oil Company has no monopoly in business ability. It is the thing for which American men are distinguished to day in the world. These qualities alone would have made a great business, and unquestionably it would have been along the line of combination, for when Mr. Rockefeller undertook to work out the good of the oil business, the tendency to combination was marked throughout the industry, but it would not have been the combination whose history we have traced. To the help of these qualities Mr. Rockefeller proposed to bring the peculiar aids of the South Improvement Company. He secured an alliance with the railroads to drive out rivals. For 15 years he received rebates of varying amounts on at least the greater part of his shipments, and for at least a portion of that time he collected drawbacks of the oil other people shipped. At the same time he worked with the railroads to prevent other people getting oil to manufacture, or if they got it, he worked with the railroads to prevent the shipment of the product. If it reached a dealer, he did his utmost to bully or wheedle him to countermand his order. If he failed in that, he undersold the dealer until the dealer, losing on his purchase, was glad enough to buy thereafter of Mr. Rockefeller. How much of this system remains in force to day? The spying on independent shipments, the effort to have orders countermanded, the predatory competition prevailing, are well enough known. Contemporaneous documents showing how these practices have worked in a very perfect and practically universal system have already been printed in this work. As for the rebates and drawbacks, if they do not exist in the forms practised up to 1887, as the Standard officials have repeatedly declared, it is not saying that the Standard enjoys no special transportation privileges. As has been pointed out, it controls the greatest pipe line handling all but perhaps 10% of the oil produced in the Eastern fields. This system is fully 35,000 miles long. It goes to the wells of every producer, gathers his oil into its storage tanks, and from there transports it to Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, Chicago, Buffalo, Cleveland, or any refining point where it is needed. This pipe line is a common carrier by virtue of its use of the right of eminent domain, and, as a common carrier, is theoretically obliged to carry and deliver the oil of all comers, but in practice this does not always work. It has happened more than once in the history of the Standard pipes that they have refused to gather or deliver oil. Pipes have been taken up from wells belonging to individuals running or working with independent refiners. Oil has been refused delivery at points practical for independent refiners. For many years the supply of oil has been so great that the Standard could not refuse oil to the independent refiner on the ground of scarcity. However, a shortage in Pennsylvania oil occurred in 1903. A very interesting situation arose as a result. There are in Ohio and Pennsylvania several independent refiners who, for a number of years, have depended on the Standard lines, the National Transit Company, for their supply of crude. In the fall of 1903 these refiners were informed that thereafter the Standard could furnish them with only 50% of their refining capacity. It was a serious matter to the independents who had their own markets, and some of whom were increasing their plants. "Supposing we buy oil directly from the producers," they asked one another, "must not the Standard as a common carrier gather and deliver it?" The experienced in the business said, "Yes, but what will happen? The producer rash enough to sell you oil may be cut off by the National Transit Company. Of course, if he wants to fight in the courts he may eventually force the Standard to reconnect, but they could delay the suit until he was ruined. Also, if you go over Mr. Seep's head" Mr. Seep is the Standard oil buyer, and all oil going into the National Transit system goes through his hands "you will antagonize him." Now, antagonize in Standard circles may mean a variety of things. The independent refiners decided to compromise, and an agreement terminable by either party at short notice was made between them and the Standard, by which the members of the former were each to have 80% of their capacity of crude oil, and were to give to the Standard all of their export oil to market. As a matter of fact, the Standard's ability to cut off crude supplies from the outside refiners is much greater than in the days before the Interstate Commerce Bill, when it depended on its alliance with the railroads to prevent its rival getting oil. It goes without saying that this is an absurd power to allow in the hands of any manufacturer of a great necessity of life. It is exactly as if one corporation, aiming at manufacturing all the flour of the country, owned all but 10% of the entire railroad system collecting and transporting wheat. They could, of course, in time of shortage prevent any would be competitor from getting grain to grind, and they could and would make it difficult and expensive at all times for him to get it. It is not only in the power of the Standard to cut off outsiders from it, it is able to keep up transportation prices. Mr. Rockefeller owns the pipe system, a common carrier, and the refineries of the Standard Oil Company pay in the final accounting cost for transporting their oil, while outsiders pay just what they paid 25 years ago. There are lawyers who believe that if this condition were tested in the courts, the National Transit Company would be obliged to give the same rates to others as the Standard refineries ultimately pay. It would be interesting to see the attempt made. Not only are outside refiners at just as great disadvantage in securing crude supply to day as before the Interstate Commerce Commission was formed, they still suffer severe discrimination on the railroads in marketing their product. There are many ways of doing things. What but discrimination is the situation which exists in the comparative rates for oil freight between Chicago and New Orleans, and Cleveland and New Orleans. All or nearly all of the refined oil sold by the Standard Oil Company through the Mississippi Valley in the West is manufactured at Whiting, Indiana, close to Chicago, and is shipped on Chicago rates. There are no important independent oil works at Chicago. Now at Cleveland, Ohio, there are independent refiners and jobbers contending for the market of the Mississippi Valley. See how prettily it is managed. The rates between the two northern cities and New Orleans in the case of nearly all commodities is about 2 cents per 100 pounds in favour of Chicago. For example, the rate on flour from Chicago is 23 cents per 100 pounds, from Cleveland 25 cents per 100 pounds. On canned goods the rates are 33 and 35, on lumber 31 and 33, on meats 51 and 54, on all sorts of iron and steel 26 and 29. But on petroleum and its products they are 23 and 33. In the case of Atlanta, Georgia, a similar vagary of rates exists. Thus Cleveland has, as a rule, about 2 cents advantage per 100 pounds over Chicago. Flour is shipped from Chicago to Atlanta at 34 cents, and from Cleveland at 32½ cents. Lumber at 32 and 28½, but Cleveland refiners actually pay 48 cents to Atlanta, while the Standard only pays 45 from Whiting. There is a curious rule in the Boston and Maine Railroad in regard to petroleum shipments. On all commodities except petroleum, what is known as the Boston rate applies, but oil does not get this. For instance, the Boston rate applies to Salem, Massachusetts, on all traffic except petroleum, and that pays 4 cents more per 100 pounds to Salem than to Boston. The New York, New Haven and Hartford Railroad
gives no through rates of petroleum from Western points, although it gives them on every other commodity. It does not refuse to take oil, but it charges the Boston rate plus the local rates. Thus, to use an illustration given by Mr. Prouty of the Interstate Commerce Commission in a recent article, if a Cleveland refiner sends into the New Haven territory, say to New Haven, a carload of oil, he pays 24 cents per 100 pounds to Boston, and the local rate of 12 cents from Boston to New Haven. On any other commodity he would pay the Boston rate. Besides, the rates on petroleum have been materially advanced over what they were when the Interstate Commerce Bill was passed in 1887, although on other commodities they have fallen. In 1887 grain was shipped from Cleveland to Boston for 22 cents, iron for 22, petroleum for 22. In 1889 the rate on grain was 15 cents, on iron 20 cents, and on petroleum 24. Of course it may be merely a coincidence that the New Haven territory can be supplied by the Standard Oil Company from its New York refineries by barge, and that William Rockefeller is a director of the New York, New Haven and Hartford Railroad. An independent refiner of Titusville, Pennsylvania, T.B. Westgate, told the Industrial Commission in 1898 that his concern was barred from shipping their products to nearly all New England and Canadian points by the refusal of the roads to give the same advantages in tariff which other freight was allowed. Mr. Westgate made the suggestive comment that very few railroads ever solicited oil trade. He pointed out that when the United States Pipe Line was building, agents of the various roads were after the oil men, soliciting shipments of the pipe, etc., to be used. We could ship iron, but the oil we must not handle. That is probably the password that goes over. Examples of this manipulation might be multiplied. There is no independent refiner or jobber who tries to ship oil freight that does not meet incessant discouragement and discrimination. Not only are rates made to favour the Standard refining points and to protect their markets, but switching charges and dock charges are multiplied. Loading and unloading facilities are refused. Payment of freights on small quantities are demanded in advance. A score of different ways are found to make hard the way of the outsider. If I get a barrel of oil out of Buffalo, an independent dealer told the writer not long ago, I have to sneak it out. There are no public docks, the railroads control most of them, and they won't let me out if they can help it. If I want to ship a carload, they won't take it if they can help it. They are all afraid of offending the Standard Oil Company. This may be a rather sweeping statement, but there is too much truth in it. There is no doubt that to day, as before the Interstate Commerce Commission, a community of interest exists between railroads and the Standard Oil Company sufficiently strong for the latter to get any help it wants in making it hard for rivals to do business. The Standard owns stock in most of the great systems. It is represented on the board of directors of nearly all the great systems, and it has an immense freight not only in oil products, but in timber, iron, acids, and all of the necessities of its factories. It is allied with many other industries, iron, steel, copper, and can swing freight away from a road which does not oblige it. It has great influence in the money market, and can help or hinder a road in securing money. It has great influence in the stock market, and can depress or inflate a stock if it sets about it. Little wonder that the railroads, being what they are afraid to disturb their relations with the Standard Oil Company, or that they keep alive a system of discriminations the same in effect as those which existed before 1887. Of course, such cases as those cited above are fit for the Interstate Commerce Commission, but the oil men as a body have no faith in the effectiveness of an appeal to the Commission, and in this feeling they do not reflect on the Commission, but rather on the ignorance and timidity of the Congress which, after creating a body which the people demanded, made it helpless. The case on which the Oil Regions rests its reason for its opinion has already been referred to in the chapter on the cooperative independent movement which finally resulted in the Pure Oil Company. The case first came before the Commission in 1888. At that time there was a small group of independent refiners in Oil City and Titusville, who were the direct outgrowth of the compromise of 1880 between the Producers' Protective Association and the Pennsylvania Railroad. The railroad, having promised open rates to all, urged the men to go into business. Soon after came the great fight between the railroads and the seaboard pipe line, with the consequent low rates. This warfare finally ended in 1884, after the Standard had brought the Tidewater into line in a pooling arrangement between the Standard, now controlling all seaboard pipe lines, and the Pennsylvania Railroad, by which the latter was guaranteed 26 per cent, of all Eastern oil shipments on condition that they keep up the rate to the seaboard to 52 cents a barrel. Now, most of the independents shipped by barrels loaded on rack cars. The Standard shipped almost entirely by tank cars. The custom had always been in the Oil Regions to charge the same for shipments whether by tank or barrel. Suddenly, in 1888, the rate of 52 cents on oil in barrels was raised to one of 66 cents. The independents believed that the raise was a manipulation of the Standard, intended to kill their export trade, and they appealed to the Commission. They pointed out that the railroads and the pipe lines had been keeping up rates for a long time by a pooling arrangement, and that now the roads made an unreasonable tariff on oil in barrels, at the same time refusing them tank cars. The hearing took place in Titusville in May, 1889. The railroads argued that they had advanced the rate on barreled oil because of a decision of the Commission itself, a case of very evident discrimination in favour of barrels. The Commission, however, argued that each case brought before it must stand on its own merits, so different were conditions and practices, and in December, 1892, it gave its decision. The pooling arrangement it did not touch, on the ground that the Commission had authority only over railroads in competition, not over railroads and pipe lines in competition. The chief complaint, that the new rate of 66 cents on oil in barrels and not on oil in tanks was an injurious discrimination, the Commission found justified. It ordered that the railroads make the rates the same on oil in both tanks and barrels, and that they furnish shippers tanks whenever reasonable notice was given. As the amounts wrongfully collected by the railroads from the refiners could not be ascertained from the evidence already taken, the Commission decided to hold another hearing and fix the amounts. This was not done until May, 1894, 5 years after the first hearing. Reparation was ordered to at least 11 different firms, some of the sums amounting to several $1,000s. The entire award ordered amounted to nearly $100,000. In case the railroads failed to adjust the claims, the refiners were ordered to proceed to enforce them in the courts. The Commission found at this hearing that none of their orders of 1892 had been followed by the roads, and they were all repeated. As was to be expected, the roads refused to recognize the claims allowed by the Commission, and the case was taken by the refiners into court. It has been heard 3 times. Twice they have won, but each time an appeal of the roads has forced them to appear again. The case was last heard at Philadelphia in February, 1904, in the United States Circuit Court of Appeals. No decision has been rendered at this writing. It would be impossible to offer direct and conclusive proof that the Standard Oil Company persuaded or forced the roads to the change of policy complained of in this case, but the presence of their leading officials and counsels at the hearings, the number of witnesses furnished from their employ, the statement of President Roberts of the Pennsylvania Railroad that the raise on barreled oil was insisted on by the seaboard refiners — the Standard was then practically the only seaboard refiner — as well as the perfectly well known relations of the railroad and the Standard, left no doubt in the minds of those who knew the situation that the order originated with them, and that its sole purpose was harassing their competitors. The Commission seems to have had no doubt of this. But see the helplessness of the Commission. It takes full testimony in 1889, digests it carefully, gives its orders in 1892, and they are not obeyed. More hearings follow, and in 1895 the orders are repeated and reparation is allowed to the injured refiners. From that time to this the case passes from court to court, the railroad seeking to escape the Commission's orders. The Interstate Commerce Commission was instituted to facilitate justice in the matter of transportation, and yet here we have still unsettled a case on which they gave their judgment 12 years ago. The lawyer who took the first appeal to the Commission, that of Rice, Robinson and Winthrop of Titusville, M. J. Haywing of Titusville, has been continuously engaged in the case for 16 years. In spite of the Interstate Commerce Commission, The crucial question is still a transportation question. Until the people of the United States have solved the question of free and equal transportation, it is idle to suppose that they will not have a trust question. So long as it is possible for a company to own the exclusive carrier on which a great natural product depends for transportation, and to use this carrier to limit a competitor's supply, or to cut off that supply entirely if the rival is offensive, and always to make him pay a higher rate than it costs the owner, it is ignorance and folly to talk about constitutional amendments limiting trusts. So long as the great manufacturing centres of a monopolistic trust can get better rates than the centres of independent effort, it is idle to talk about laws making it a crime to undersell for the purpose of driving a competitor from a market. You must get into markets before you can compete. So long as railroads can be persuaded to interfere with independent pipe lines, to refuse oil freight, to refuse loading facilities, lest they disturb their relations with the Standard Oil Company, it is idle to talk about investigations or antitrust legislation or application of the Sherman Law. So long as the Standard Oil Company can control transportation as it does to day, it will remain master of the oil industry, and the people of the United States will pay for their indifference and folly in regard to transportation a good sound tax on oil, and they will yearly see an increasing concentration of natural resources and transportation systems in the Standard Oil crowd. If all the country had suffered from these raids on competition had been the limiting of the business opportunity of a few hundred men and a constant higher price for refined oil, the case would be serious enough. But there is a more serious side to it. The ethical cost of all this is the deep concern. We are a commercial people. We cannot boast of our arts, our crafts, our cultivation. Our boast is in the wealth we produce. As a consequence, business success is sanctified, and practically any methods which achieve it are justified by a larger and larger class. All sorts of subterfuges and sophistries and slurring over of facts are employed to explain aggregations of capital whose determining factor has been like that of the Standard Oil Company, special privileges obtained by persistent secret effort in opposition to the spirit of the law, the efforts of legislatures, and the most outspoken public opinion. How often does one hear it argued, the Standard Oil Company is simply an inevitable result of economic conditions. That is, given the practices of the oil bearing railroads in 1872, and the elements of speculation and the over refining in the oil business, there was nothing for Mr. Rockefeller to do but secure special privileges if he wished to save his business. Now in 1872 Mr. Rockefeller owned a successful refinery in Cleveland. He had the advantage of water transportation a part of the year, access to two great trunk lines the year around. Under such able management as he could give it, his concern was bound to go on, given the demand for refined oil. It was bound to draw other firms to it. When he went into the South Improvement Company, it was not to save his own business, but to destroy others. When he worked so persistently to secure rebates after the breaking up of the South Improvement Company, it was in the face of an industry united against them. It was not to save his business that he compelled the Empire Transportation Company to go out of the oil business in 1877. Nothing but grave mismanagement could have destroyed his business at that moment. It was to get every refinery in the country but his own out of the way. It was not the necessity to save his business which compelled Mr. Rockefeller to make war on the Tidewater. He and the Tidewater could both have lived. It was to prevent prices of transportation and of refined oil going down under competition. What necessity was there for Mr. Rockefeller trying to prevent the United States Pipe Line doing business? Only the greed of power and money. Every great campaign against rival interests which the Standard Oil Company has carried on has been inaugurated not to save its life, but to build up and sustain a monopoly in the oil industry. These are not mere affirmations of a hostile critic. They are facts, proved by documents and figures. Certain defenders go further and say that if some such combination had not been formed, the oil industry would have failed for lack of brains and capital. Such a statement is puerile. Here was an industry for whose output the whole world was crying. Petroleum came at the moment when the value and necessity of a new cheap light was recognized everywhere. Before Mr. Rockefeller had ventured outside of Cleveland, kerosene was going in quantities to every civilized country. Nothing could stop it, nothing check it, but the discovery of some cheaper light or the putting up of its price. The real good of the oil business in 1872 lay in making oil cheaper. It would flow all over the world on its own merit, if cheap enough. The claim that only by some such aggregation as Mr. Rockefeller formed could enough capital have been obtained to develop the business falls utterly in face of fact. Look at the enormous amounts of capital, a large amount of it speculative, to be sure, which the oil men claim went into their business in the first 10 years. It was estimated that Philadelphia alone put $168,000,000 into the development of the Oil Regions, and New York $134,000,000 in their first decade of business. How this estimate was reached, the authority for it does not say. It may have been the total capitalization of the various oil companies launched in the two cities in that period. It shows very well, however, in what sort of figures the oil men were dealing. When the South Improvement Company trouble came in 1872, the producers launched a statement in regard to the condition of their business, in which they claimed they were using a capital of $200,000,000. Figures based on the number of oil wells in operation or drilling at that time, of course, represent only a portion of the capital in use. Wildcatting and speculation have always demanded a large amount of the money that the oil men handled. The almost conservative figures in regard to the capital invested in the Oil Regions in the early years were those of H. E. Wrigley, of the Geological Survey of Pennsylvania. Mr. Wrigley estimates that in the first 12 years of the business $235,000,000 was received from wells. This includes the cost of the land, of putting down and operating the well, also the profit on the product. This estimate, however, makes no allowance for the sums used in speculation, an estimate indeed which it was impossible for one to make with any accuracy. The figures, unsatisfactory as they are ample proof, however, that there was plenty of money in the early days to carry on the oil business. Indeed, there has always been plenty of money for oil investment. It did not require Mr. Rockefeller's capital to develop the Bradford oil fields, build the first seaboard pipe line, open West Virginia, Texas, or Kansas. The oil business would no more have suffered for lack of capital without the Standard Combination than the iron or wheat or railroad or cotton business. The claim is idle, given the wealth and energy of the country in the 45 years since the discovery of oil. Equally well does both the history and the present condition of the oil business show that it has not needed any such aggregation to give us cheap oil. The margin between crude and refined was made low by competition. It has rarely been as low as it would have been had there been free competition. For 5 years even the small independent refineries outside the Pure Oil Company have been able to make a profit on the prices set by the Standard, and this in spite of the higher transportation they have paid on both crude and refined, and the wall of seclusion the railroads built around domestic markets. Very often people who admit the facts, who are willing to see that Mr. Rockefeller has employed force and fraud to secure his ends, justify him by declaring, "It's business." That is, its business has come to be a legitimate excuse for hard dealing, sly tricks, special privileges. It is a common enough thing to hear men arguing that the ordinary laws of morality do not apply in business. Now, if the Standard Oil Company were the only concern in the country guilty of practices which have given it monopolistic power, this story would never have been written. Were it alone in these methods, public scorn would long ago have made short work of the Standard Oil Company. But it is simply the most conspicuous type of what can be done by these practices. The methods it employs with such acumen, persistency, and secrecy are employed by all sorts of business men, from corner grocers up to bankers. If exposed, they are excused on the ground that this is business. If the point is pushed, Frequently the defender of the practice falls back on the Christian doctrine of charity, and points that we are erring mortals and must allow for each other's weaknesses, an excuse which, if carried to its legitimate conclusion, would leave our business men weeping on one another's shoulders over human frailty, while they picked one another's pockets. One of the most depressing features of the ethical side of the matter is that instead of such methods arousing contempt, they are more or less openly admired. And this is logical. Canonize business success, and men who make a success like that of the Standard Oil Trust become national heroes. The history of its organization is studied as a practical lesson in money making. It is the one most startling feature of the case to one who would like to feel that it is possible to become commercial people and yet a race of gentlemen. Of course, such practices exclude men by all the codes from the rank of gentlemen, just as such practices would exclude men from the sporting world or athletic field. There is no gaming table in the world where loaded dice are tolerated, no athletic field where men must not start fair. Yet Mr. Rockefeller has systematically played with loaded dice, and it is doubtful if there has ever been a time since 1872 when he has run a race with a competitor and started fair. Business played in this way loses all its sportsmanlike qualities. It is fit only for tricksters. The effects on the very men who fight these methods on the ground that they are ethically wrong are deplorable. Brought into competition with the trust, badgered, foiled, spied upon, they come to feel as if anything is fair when the Standard is the opponent. The bitterness against the Standard Oil Company in many parts of Pennsylvania and Ohio is such that a verdict from a jury on the merits of the evidence is almost impossible. A case in point occurred a few years ago in the Bradford field. An oil producer was discovered stealing oil from the National Transit Company. He had tapped the main line and for at least 2 years had run a small but steady stream of Standard oil into his private tank. Finally the thieving pipe was discovered, and the owner of it, after acknowledging his guilt, was brought to trial. The jury gave a verdict of not guilty. They seemed to feel that though the guilt was acknowledged, there probably was a Standard trick concealed somewhere. Anyway, it was from the Standard Oil Company, and it deserved to be stolen from. The writer has frequently heard men, whose own business was conducted with scrupulous fairness, say in cases of similar stealing that they would never condemn a man who stole from the Standard. Of course, such a state of feeling underlines the whole moral nature of a community. The blackmailing cases of which the Standard Oil Company complained are a natural result of its own practices. Men going into an independent refining business have for years been accustomed to say, "Well, if they won't let us alone, we'll make them pay a good price." The Standard complains that such men build simply to sell out. There may be cases of this. Probably there are, though the writer has no absolute proof of any such. Certainly there is no satisfactory proof that the refinery in the famous Buffalo case was built to sell, though that it was offered for sale when the opposition of the Everests, the managers of the Standard concern, had become so serious as later to be stamped as criminal by judge and jury, there is no doubt. Certainly nothing was shown to have been done or said by Mr. Matthews, the owner of the concern which the Standard was fighting, which might not have been expected from a man who had met the kind of opposition he had from the time he went into business. The truth is, blackmail and every other business vice is the natural result of the peculiar business practices of the Standard. If business is to be treated as warfare and not as a peaceful pursuit, as they have persisted in treating it, they cannot expect the men they are fighting to lie down and die without a struggle. If they get special privileges, they must expect their competitors to struggle to get them. If they will find it more profitable to buy out a refinery than to let it live, they must expect the owner to get an extortionate price if he can. And when they complain of these practices and call them blackmail, they show thin sporting blood. They must not expect to monopolize hard feelings if they do oil. These are considerations of the ethical effect of such business practices on those outside and in competition. As for those within the organization, there is one obvious effect worth noting. The Standard men as a body have nothing to do with public affairs, except as it is necessary to manipulate them for the good of the oil business. The notion that the business man must not appear in politics and religion save as a stand patter, not even as a thinking, aggressive force, is demoralising intellectually and morally. Ever since 1872 the organisation has appeared in politics only to oppose legislation obviously for the public good. At that time the oil industry was young, only 12 years old, and it was suffering from too rapid growth, from speculation, from rapacity of railroads, but it was struggling manfully with all these questions. The question of railroad discriminations and extortions was one of the live questions of the country. The oil men as a mass were allied against it. The theory that the railroad was a public servant bound by the spirit of its charter to treat all shippers alike, that fair play demanded open, equal rates to all, was generally held in the oil country at the time Mr. Rockefeller and his friends sprung the South Improvement Company. One has only to read the oil journals at the time of the Oil War of 1872 to see how seriously all phases of the transportation question were considered. The country was a unit against the rebate system. Agreements were signed with the railroads that all rates henceforth should be equal. The signatures were not on before Mr. Rockefeller had a rebate, and gradually others got them, until the Standard had won the advantages it expected the South Improvement Company to give it. From that time to this, Mr. Rockefeller has had to fight the best sentiment of the oil country and of the country at large as to what is for the public good. He and his colleagues kept a strong alliance in Washington fighting the Interstate Commerce Bill from the time the first one was introduced in 1876 until the final passage in 1887. Every measure looking into the freedom and equalisation of transportation has met his opposition, as have bills for giving greater publicity to the operations of corporations. In many of the great state legislatures one of the first persons to be pointed out to a visitor is the Standard Oil lobbyist. Now no one can dispute the right of the Standard Oil Company to express its opinions on proposed legislation. It has the same right to do this as all the rest of the world. It is only the character of its opposition which is open to criticism, the fact that it is always fighting measures which equalise privileges, and which make it more necessary for men to start fair and play fair in doing business. Of course, the effect of directly practising many of their methods is obvious. For example, take the whole system of keeping track of independent business. There are practices required which corrupt every man who has a hand in them. One of the most deplorable things about it is that most of the work is done by youngsters. The freight clerk who reports the independent oil shipments for a fee of $5 or $10 a month is probably a young man, learning his first lessons in corporate morality. If he happens to sit in Mr. Rockefeller's church on Sundays, through what sort of a haze will he receive the teachings? There is something alarming to those who believe that commerce should be a peaceful pursuit, and who believe that the moral law holds good throughout the entire range of human relations, in knowing that so large a body of young men in this country are consciously or unconsciously growing up with the idea that business is war, and that morals have nothing to do with its practice. And what are we going to do about it? For it is our business. We, the people of the United States, and nobody else, must cure whatever is wrong in the industrial situation, typified by this narrative of the growth of the Standard Oil Company. That our first task is to secure free and equal transportation privileges by rail, pipe, and waterway is evident. It is not an easy matter. It is one which may require operations which will seem severe. But the whole system of discrimination has been nothing but violence, and those who have profited by it cannot complain if the curing of the evils they have wrought bring hardship in turn on them. At all events, until the transportation matter is settled, and settled right, the monopolistic trust will be with us, a leech on our pockets, a barrier to our free efforts. As for the ethical side, there is no cure but in an increasing scorn of unfair play, an increasing sense that a thing won by breaking the rules of the game is not worth the winning. when the business man who fights to secure special privileges, to crowd his competitor off the track by other than fair competitive methods, receives the same summary disdainful ostracism by his fellows that the doctor or lawyer who is unprofessional, the athlete who abuses the rules, receives, we shall have gone a long way toward making commerce a fit pursuit for our young men. This is the end of the history of Standard Oil by Ida M. Tarbell. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.